At the close of the 13th century, the landscape of Anatolia stood at the crossroads of empires, faiths, and migrations. The great Seljuk Sultanate of Rome, which had once governed the region with Persianized Islamic authority, was in visible decline. Its cohesion had been shattered by Mongol incursions, internal rivalries, and economic exhaustion. Beyond its decaying administrative centers, the political order fractured into numerous small Turkish principalities known as beyliks. Each was ruled by a warlord, often claiming spiritual legitimacy as a ghazi, a warrior in service of Islam, yet operating within an intensely local and pragmatic context. The Byzantine Empire, which had once extended deep into Anatolia, remained weakened after the Fourth Crusade and the Latin occupation of Constantinople. Its remaining territories along the western coast and around the capital were fragile, their defenses thin, their resources diminished. Between these two exhausted civilizations lay a patchwork frontier, neither fully Christian nor fully Muslim, where nomadic bands, peasant communities, and religious fraternities intermingled and adapted to perpetual uncertainty. In this frontier world, power was measured less by inherited authority than by the ability to mobilize people. Military strength, tribal loyalty, and economic opportunity shaped alliances that could shift with each campaign season. The pastoral Turkmen, descendants of Oghuz nomads from Central Asia, roamed the borderlands in search of grazing land and plunder. Many attached themselves to charismatic leaders who promised both material reward and divine merit through conquest. This atmosphere of constant mobility fostered a unique blend of cultures. Persian bureaucratic traditions, Arabic scholarship, and Turkic warrior ethos all coexisted within the same communities. The frontier zones became zones of fusion rather than simple boundaries. The region around the towns of Sagat and Damanik, in northwestern Anatolia, epitomized this frontier condition. It lay close enough to Byzantine lands to allow for raiding and trade, yet far enough from Mongol control to remain autonomous. Here, sometime around 1290, a minor chieftain named Osman, son of Ertugrul, established a modest principality. Contemporary sources about Osman are scarce, and later Ottoman chronicles, written under the authority of his descendants, would portray him as a divinely guided founder. Yet historical reconstruction suggests a more grounded reality. Osman likely began as one of many local beys commanding a few hundred cavalry and maintaining allegiance to the Seljuk Sultan in name only. What distinguished his domain was not its size, but its location. The proximity to Byzantine fortresses provided both opportunity and danger. Osman's men could raid Christian territories and attract followers eager for spoils, while his alliances with neighboring Turkish tribes and dervish orders reinforced his legitimacy among the Muslim population. The structure of these early frontier societies relied on shared participation rather than formal hierarchy. Warriors contributed arms and horses in return for a share of booty. Religious leaders, particularly Sufi sheikhs, offered moral sanction and mediated disputes. Peasants provided grain and labor under customary obligations rather than imposed taxation. In this context, Osman's leadership can be understood as the skillful management of relationships across social and religious lines. Archaeological surveys of the region show a gradual pattern of settlement growth around fortified villages, suggesting that his domain offered a measure of security and stability in an otherwise volatile landscape. As rival beyliks competed for territory, Osman's principality began to attract migrants, farmers fleeing Mongol taxation in central Anatolia and artisans displaced from Byzantine towns. The 13th century frontier was not a place of isolation, but of contact. Caravan routes connected Anatolia with Persia and the Black Sea, bringing silk, ceramics, and metalwork. Markets along these routes facilitated not only commerce, but cultural exchange. Greek-speaking Christians, Armenian traders, and Muslim craftsmen frequently interacted, each community adapting to the multilingual and multi-religious environment. This economic and social fluidity made the frontier resilient to collapse. When imperial administrations fell, local networks of production and trade endured. The Ottomans would later inherit and expand these systems, but in their earliest phase, they merely participated in an already dynamic frontier economy. Environmental factors also shaped the emergence of early Ottoman power. The Marmara region offered fertile plains, access to river valleys, and mild winters conducive to mixed agriculture and herding. Control of mountain passes enabled the beys to regulate trade routes between the plateau and the coast. By establishing small garrisons and fortresses, Osman could both protect his population and assert authority over key resources. Archaeological evidence from early Ottoman sites shows simple but organized layouts, mosques, grain storage facilities, and watchtowers, indicating that the principality quickly developed beyond a nomadic base into a sedentary settlement pattern. Religious life in this frontier environment was equally adaptive. Sufi brotherhoods, particularly those associated with the Bektashi and Mevlevi orders, played a central role in integrating diverse populations. They offered spiritual guidance but also social cohesion, operating lodges that served as inns, schools, and centers of hospitality. These orders blurred the line between sacred and secular life. Their emphasis on inclusivity and devotion resonated among frontier peoples accustomed to cultural hybridity. Osman and his successors cultivated alliances with such figures, recognizing that religious legitimacy could secure loyalty where formal institutions were weak. The decline of centralized Seljuk authority created space for new forms of governance to emerge. While most beyliks remained small and short-lived, the Ottomans demonstrated a distinctive capacity for institutional adaptation. Instead of relying solely on kinship ties, they began to incorporate local notables, both Muslim and Christian, into their administrative framework. Early Ottoman tax registers suggest pragmatic inclusion. Village leaders were retained in office under new authority, ensuring continuity of local governance. This practice of flexible incorporation would later become a hallmark of Ottoman statecraft, allowing the empire to expand without constant rebellion. The political vacuum left by Byzantium's waning influence further accelerated this process. Many frontier Christians, disillusioned by imperial neglect and heavy taxation, found advantage in aligning with Ottoman rule. Conversion to Islam occurred gradually, often motivated by social mobility or economic incentive rather than coercion. Over time, mixed communities emerged where identity was defined less by faith than by allegiance to the emerging Ottoman household. This pragmatic tolerance, rooted in necessity rather than ideology, became another key to Ottoman endurance. The military dimension of Osman's principality reflected the realities of frontier warfare. Small, mobile cavalry units specialized in raiding, reconnaissance, and siege tactics suited to rugged terrain. Success depended on local knowledge, speed, and disciplined coordination. The early Ottomans adopted techniques from their Byzantine and Mongol neighbors, creating a hybrid military system that emphasized flexibility. Over the next generations, this would evolve into the empire's famed Janissary Corps and provincial armies, but its foundations lay in these first adaptive militias. Economic records, though limited, point to gradual centralization under Osman's rule. Coinage bearing his successors' names appears within decades, signaling the assertion of sovereignty. The decision to mint coins was not merely practical. It was a statement of legitimacy, an acknowledgement that the ruler possessed the authority to guarantee value and order. In parallel, the construction of mosques and public works served as tangible symbols of governance. These early investments in infrastructure underscored an awareness that enduring power required stability, not only victory. By the early 14th century, the Ottomans had established a reputation among neighboring powers as reliable allies and formidable opponents. Byzantine sources mention Osman's forces with growing concern, noting their disciplined raids and capacity to capture fortified towns. The gradual encirclement of Byzantine outposts along the Marmara coast demonstrated strategic foresight. Unlike many contemporaneous beyliks that dissipated through internecine conflict, the Ottomans pursued expansion with calculated persistence. Their approach combined warfare with diplomacy, integrating conquered populations rather than annihilating them. Scholars examining this period emphasize the significance of frontier dynamics in shaping the Ottoman worldview. Living at the edge of two civilizations, Islamic and Byzantine, produced a political culture defined by adaptability. It valued negotiation as much as conquest, loyalty as much as faith. This frontier mentality, once born out of survival, evolved into a governing philosophy capable of managing vast diversity. The emergence of Osman's principality therefore represents more than the rise of a dynasty. It marks a transformation in the very concept of empire in the post-Mongol world. Archaeological studies of early Ottoman sites, such as Bilsik and Yenishehir, reveal layers of cultural continuity from earlier Byzantine settlements. Pottery styles, urban layouts, and agricultural patterns persisted, suggesting that Ottoman rule did not disrupt local life but redirected its surplus toward a new political center. This gradual integration, part conquest, part continuity, explains why Ottoman authority expanded with minimal destruction compared to other medieval invasions. Where others ruled through coercion, the Ottomans learned to rule through adaptation. Over the subsequent decades, these modest beginnings evolved into a coherent polity. The combination of fertile geography, inclusive administration, and religious legitimacy forged an identity distinct from both Seljuk and Byzantine precedents. When Osman died, likely around 1324, he left behind not merely territory, but an idea that governance could bridge frontier divisions. His successors, inheriting this vision, transformed it into a durable state structure. The 13th century frontier of Anatolia, therefore, served as the crucible of Ottoman civilization. The conditions of instability and cultural plurality that defined it were not obstacles, but catalysts. They forced innovation in military organization, administrative practice, and religious inclusivity. In an age when many medieval states collapsed under their own rigidity, the Ottomans' flexibility proved their greatest asset. The rise of Osman's principality signaled a shift in regional balance. What began as a borderland refuge for displaced peoples became a nucleus of renewal. From these early networks of farmers, dervishes, and warriors would emerge an empire that bridged continents. The structures laid down in this formative stage, participatory governance, frontier inclusion, and strategic pragmatism, would persist for centuries as the empire's enduring foundations. As the 14th century unfolded, Osman's son Orhan expanded upon this inheritance, transforming a confederation of tribes into a recognized state. The establishment of Bursa as a capital, the introduction of coinage, and the beginnings of institutional government would mark the next decisive stage in Ottoman development. The frontier that had nurtured a small band of warriors was about to produce a dynasty capable of shaping the course of world history. When the town of Bursa fell to the Ottomans in 1326, it marked more than a conquest. It was the tangible emergence of a state from the fluid frontier world of Western Anatolia. Under Orhan, son of Osman, the small principality took on the recognizable structure of a political organism, a seat of power, a system of administration, a standing army, and a vision of continuity. The story of Bursa's rise is not one of sudden transformation, but of deliberate adaptation. The moment when a tribal emirate began to define itself as a state with permanence and identity. The transition began with Osman's death and Orhan's accession. The early sources are uncertain about the exact year of Osman's passing, though most agree it occurred shortly before or after Bursa's capture. The succession was smooth, a rarity among contemporary beyliks. This stability reflected both family consensus and the growing sense of collective purpose among the frontier warriors. Orhan's assumption of power demonstrated the Ottomans' emerging principle of dynastic continuity, a practice that would distinguish them from the short-lived polities of their time. The capture of Bursa was an achievement shaped by patience rather than force. For years, Ottoman forces had surrounded the city, isolating it from Byzantine supply lines. The Byzantine garrison eventually capitulated, and Orhan entered a city that had been a key node in the trade routes of Bithynia for centuries. Unlike many conquerors of the age, he did not destroy it. Instead, he established Bursa as the new administrative capital, initiating a phase of urban revival that blended Byzantine urban structure with new Islamic civic ideals. Within the city, Orhan commissioned mosques, public baths, and charitable foundations known as vakifs. The construction of the Orhan Gazi Mosque and its associated complex symbolized a new order grounded in both governance and faith. These foundations were not merely religious institutions, but economic mechanisms, sustaining scholars, artisans, and caretakers through endowed lands and revenues. They reflected a broader principle that would characterize Ottoman governance for centuries: the interdependence of authority, faith, and community welfare. Bursa's population reflected the pluralism of the frontier. Greeks, Armenians, Turks, and converts lived side by side, often bound by trade and craft. Orhan's administration did not attempt mass conversion or expulsion. Instead, it integrated existing social structures into a framework of Islamic rule. The tax registers from the 14th century, though fragmentary, suggest that Christian peasants continued to farm their lands under the new authority, paying taxes similar to those levied by the Byzantines. This pragmatic tolerance helped stabilize the new state and sustain its economy. One of Orhan's most lasting achievements was the establishment of the first standing Ottoman army. The early warriors who had fought alongside Osman were bound by loyalty and opportunity rather than formal service. Orhan institutionalized this military tradition through the creation of the Yaya infantry and Musallam cavalry. The Yaya were salaried foot soldiers who received regular payment and provisions, while the Musallam were cavalrymen granted tax exemptions in exchange for military service. This structure represented an embryonic bureaucracy of defense, a model that later evolved into the famed Janissary and Timar systems. The organization of land became another cornerstone of Orhan's statecraft. Lands conquered from Byzantine domains were redistributed as Timars, fiefs granted to soldiers and officials who collected taxes in return for maintaining order and military readiness. The Timar system balanced reward with responsibility, ensuring that expansion fed directly into administrative and economic consolidation. It also curtailed the fragmentation common among neighboring beyliks, where land often became the personal possession of tribal leaders. Under Orhan, property and power were tied to service and hierarchy. Coinage was another expression of sovereignty. Around the mid-14th century, Orhan minted silver coins bearing his name, a declaration that the Ottomans now viewed themselves as more than a band of frontier warriors. These coins circulated widely in western Anatolia and the Aegean trade networks, signaling both legitimacy and confidence. The use of Arabic inscriptions alongside Turkic titles reflected a dual identity, rooted in the Islamic world yet aware of the multicultural context in which the Ottomans operated. Bursa's strategic position at the intersection of Anatolia and the Balkans allowed Orhan to consolidate control over regional trade. Caravans brought goods from Iran, Syria, and the Black Sea to Bursa's markets, while merchants from Venice and Genoa traded cloth, metal, and spices. The Ottomans encouraged this commerce through the protection of caravan routes and the maintenance of roads and bridges. This economic vitality was not accidental. It reflected a conscious policy of stability and predictability that attracted traders seeking security in an age of instability. Religion remained a defining pillar of legitimacy. Orhan, while personally devout, treated Islam as both faith and institution. He established the first Ottoman madrasa in Iznik, ancient Nicaea, appointing the scholar David I Kayseri as its head. This step formalized education and law within the state, linking Ottoman authority to the intellectual traditions of Islamic jurisprudence and philosophy. It was in this period that the Hanafi school of law began to take root as the empire's judicial foundation, ensuring consistency in governance across diverse populations. Orhan's reign also saw the gradual professionalization of governance. Administrative offices began to differentiate. Treasurers, judges, and scribes appeared as distinct roles. The use of seals and written decrees became more common, marking a shift from oral to bureaucratic authority. The Ottomans were learning from their Byzantine and Seljuk predecessors, selectively adopting practices that strengthened control without diluting their identity. The frontier emirate was evolving into a structured polity, one capable of projecting both military and administrative power. A major turning point in Orhan's era was the crossing into Europe. Around 1352, Ottoman auxiliaries were invited to support a Byzantine faction during the empire's internal civil war. In return, they were granted a foothold at Simp fortress on the Gallipoli Peninsula. When an earthquake later devastated the region, the Ottomans seized the opportunity to fortify their position. This event is often cited as the beginning of Ottoman Europe, the first permanent bridgehead that would, within decades, expand across the Balkans. The crossing into Gallipoli symbolized a transformation in Ottoman identity. No longer confined to the Anatolian frontier, the state became a transcontinental power. This new dimension required adaptation, new military logistics, new diplomatic relations, and a new understanding of imperial destiny. Yet Orhan approached these challenges with the same pragmatism that had guided his father. The Ottomans did not abandon their Anatolian base. Instead, they treated Europe as an extension of their frontier ethos, a landscape of opportunity to be navigated through strategy and endurance. Orhan's family and succession practices also shaped the dynasty's continuity. His marriage to Nilüfer Hatun, traditionally believed to be of Byzantine origin, symbolized the blending of cultures at the heart of the Ottoman experience. Their son Murad inherited not only power, but also the lessons of stability and organization. The court at Bursa functioned as a school of governance, where young princes observed the art of ruling, commanding, and administering. The early emphasis on dynastic training would later mature into the palace education system of the imperial period. Culturally, the 14th century marked the beginnings of an Ottoman aesthetic. Architecture, calligraphy, and literature began to reflect a synthesis of Turkic, Persian, and Byzantine influences. The Bursa mosques, with their simple domes and balanced proportions, displayed an early architectural language that valued clarity and function. Inscriptions in Arabic and Persian celebrated piety and justice, while artisans developed new techniques in tilework and textiles that foreshadowed later imperial styles. Socially, the Ottoman state of Orhan's time was a mosaic of rural and urban life. In the countryside, small villages sustained themselves through agriculture and pastoralism, while the towns became centers of trade and craft. The Ottoman administration imposed modest taxes but ensured protection and order, a key factor in attracting settlers to their domain. Chroniclers of later centuries noted that this early justice and security were among the main reasons the empire's population grew steadily even during turbulent times elsewhere. Bursa's role as a capital extended beyond politics. It became a center of learning and spirituality, home to scholars, Sufi masters, and jurists. The coexistence of orthodox and mystical currents within Islam was characteristic of early Ottoman religious life. Sufi orders, such as the Mevlevis and Bektashis, provided moral guidance and social cohesion, bridging the gap between the state and the populace. Their lodges functioned as places of charity, education, and refuge, quietly shaping the ethical foundation of Ottoman society. As the 14th century drew to a close, Orhan's long reign gave the Ottomans a stability unmatched among their neighbors. The Mongols had receded into the eastern steppes, and the Byzantines had become confined largely to Constantinople and its immediate surroundings. The Anatolian beyliks remained fragmented, but the Ottomans had developed an institutional depth that ensured survival beyond any single ruler. Their combination of military efficiency, administrative coherence, and religious legitimacy made them resilient in the face of external shocks. When Orhan died around 1362, the state he left behind was no longer a frontier principality. It was an organized polity with a functioning bureaucracy, standing army, urban capital, and clear dynastic lineage. The transfer of power to his son Murad I was peaceful, confirming the principle that succession should preserve order rather than invite division. This tradition, rooted in Orhan's example, would remain a central ideal of Ottoman governance even as later centuries brought challenges of scale and ambition. The legacy of Bursa endured well beyond Orhan's lifetime. It remained a royal city and burial place for the dynasty, symbolizing continuity and legitimacy. The practices established there, vakifs, timars, coinage, education, and religious endowment, became templates for later imperial systems. Each represented the pragmatic synthesis of frontier experience and administrative sophistication. Through them, the Ottomans built the foundations of a state that could expand, absorb, and endure. The transformation that began in Bursa was not inevitable. It required the unique combination of geography, leadership, and cultural adaptability that defined the early Ottoman experience. By turning a conquered city into a functioning capital, Orhan and his administrators demonstrated a principle that would guide the empire's growth for centuries. Power alone was transient, but institutions created continuity. From the vantage of later history, the rise of Bursa appears as a quiet revolution. The frontier warriors of Osman's day had become the stewards of a structured, enduring order. The balance between faith and pragmatism, between conquest and governance, had been achieved. The Ottomans were now ready to move beyond survival into expansion, setting their gaze westward across the straits toward the complex and divided lands of the Balkans. The consolidation at Bursa thus marked both an end and a beginning, the completion of the Anatolian foundation and the threshold of a new transcontinental phase. The lessons of organization, tolerance, and structured authority learned in these formative years would carry forward as the Ottomans transformed from a principality into an empire that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean world for centuries to come. When Murad I assumed power in the early 1360s, he inherited a principality that had already matured into a functioning state. His father, Orhan, had built the foundations, a stable capital, a standing army, a defined administration, and a vision of continuity. Yet the true test of the Ottoman system lay ahead. To survive among the shifting powers of the 14th century, the Ottomans would need to extend their influence beyond Anatolia to the contested lands of the Balkans. In Murad's reign, the frontier evolved into an empire, and the balance between faith, power, and pragmatism took on continental significance. The Balkans in the mid-14th century were a landscape of political fragmentation. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by internal disputes and economic decline, held little more than Constantinople and a few scattered territories. The Serbian Empire had briefly flourished under Stefan Dusan, but disintegrated after his death in 1355, leaving behind rival principalities. The Bulgarians were divided, while the remnants of Latin and Greek rule along the Aegean coast vied for survival. Into this vacuum stepped the Ottomans, who combined military discipline with administrative flexibility. Their expansion into Europe was not a sudden eruption of conquest, but a steady, calculated process built on alliances, vassalage, and control of key routes. Murad I's first major initiative was to secure the Ottoman foothold on the Gallipoli Peninsula, gained during his father's reign. Gallipoli served as the bridge between Asia and Europe, the crossing point of troops, supplies, and ideas. By fortifying the peninsula and maintaining a permanent garrison there, Murad ensured that the Ottomans could move freely across the Dardanelles. This control of the straits was more than strategic. It symbolized the transformation of a regional power into a transcontinental one. From this point onward, the Ottoman state was both European and Asian, operating with equal familiarity on both sides of the water. The early campaigns under Murad were marked by calculated diplomacy. Instead of directly confronting all Balkan states, he exploited their rivalries. The Ottomans supported certain factions, offered terms of vassalage, and gradually absorbed territories through tribute and marriage alliances. Town by town, region by region, they advanced into Thrace and Macedonia. The Byzantine Emperor John V Palaiologos, weakened by civil conflict, became a nominal vassal of Murad in 1373, a striking reversal of fortune for what had once been the greatest empire of the eastern Mediterranean. In return, Murad provided military assistance against Byzantine rivals, ensuring a peace that benefited Ottoman consolidation. The capture of Adrianople, modern Edirne, around 1369 or 1371 marked a pivotal moment. Murad moved his court there, making it the first Ottoman capital in Europe. Edirne's location was ideal, close enough to Anatolia to maintain connections, yet deep enough into Europe to control Balkan trade and politics. From Edirne, Ottoman forces could project power north toward the Danube, west toward the Adriatic, and south towad Greece. The city's transformation reflected the empire's growing complexity. Mosques, markets, baths, and caravanserais appeared alongside churches and synagogues, creating a cosmopolitan environment that mirrored Bursa's earlier synthesis. Murad's administrative reforms deepened the state's institutional base. He expanded the Timar system, granting fiefs in the newly conquered European lands to loyal soldiers and officials. This practice rewarded service while ensuring local order and economic productivity. It also bound the frontier warriors to the Sultan's authority, turning potential rivals into instruments of governance. The revenue from these lands sustained the cavalry forces, the Sipahis, who became the backbone of the Ottoman military structure. Through the Timar network, conquest translated into enduring control. Another innovation attributed to Murad's reign was the formation of the Kapikalu, the core household troops of the Sultan, later epitomized by the Janissaries. While the precise origins of the Janissary Corps are debated, this period witnessed the early recruitment of Christian youths through the Devshirme system, a levy that converted and trained them for service. These soldiers owed direct allegiance to the Sultan and were maintained by the central treasury, independent of local ties. Their discipline and organization distinguished them from the more traditional tribal levies, representing the emergence of a professional military elite that would dominate Ottoman warfare for centuries. The consolidation of power also demanded a coherent legal and administrative order. Murad formalized the office of Qadi, or judge, ensuring that justice was administered consistently across the expanding domains. Each district had a Qadi responsible for legal decisions, record-keeping, and local governance. These courts became the administrative arteries of the empire, blending Islamic law with customary practices. The presence of written registers and decrees reflected an evolving bureaucracy, one that valued record and precedent as the instruments of authority. Murad's statecraft rested on a careful equilibrium between Islamic legitimacy and pragmatic inclusivity. In newly conquered Christian territories, churches were generally allowed to remain open, and local leaders often retained their positions under Ottoman oversight. Tribute payments and local autonomy encouraged compliance without widespread rebellion. This approach contrasted sharply with the harsher policies of many medieval conquerors and contributed to the Ottomans' reputation for order. As long as taxes were paid and peace maintained, communities could practice their faith and manage their internal affairs. This administrative tolerance was not ideological benevolence, it was political rationality. Stability meant revenue, and revenue meant endurance. The expansion into the Balkans, however, was not without resistance. The most formidable challenge of Murad's reign came from the Serbian and Bulgarian coalitions that sought to halt Ottoman advances. In 1371, at the Battle of the Maritsa River, Ottoman forces under Murad's generals crushed a Serbian army, establishing dominance over much of Macedonia. The victory was decisive, both militarily and psychologically. Many Balkan rulers, recognizing the futility of direct confrontation, chose instead to accept Ottoman suzerainty. They retained their local autonomy but paid tribute and provided troops when required. Thus, the Ottoman presence spread not only through conquest but through the gradual web of vassalage. Over the next 2 decades, Murad continued to consolidate his hold on the region. His forces captured Sofia, Serres, and parts of Thessaly, bringing the Ottomans into direct contact with Central European powers. Diplomacy alternated with warfare as Hungarian and Wallachian forces tested the Ottoman frontier. The Ottomans responded with a combination of military resilience and flexible negotiation, a pattern that would define their relations with Europe for generations. Murad's reign marked the transition from opportunistic raiding to organized imperial expansion. In 1389, the Ottomans faced their greatest early test at the Battle of Kosovo. A coalition of Serbian and allied forces gathered under Prince Lazar to resist further Ottoman encroachment. The battle, fought on the plains of Kosovo Palj, became one of the defining moments of Balkan history. Contemporary chronicles are fragmentary, but the outcome was clear. Both Murad and Lazar fell, yet the Ottoman army held the field. The Serbian state was effectively broken, and the Balkans remained open to further Ottoman advance. Murad's death, reportedly at the hands of a Serbian assassin in the aftermath of battle, was a reminder of the personal risks of medieval kingship. Yet the orderly succession of his son Bayezid I, known as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, demonstrated the state's resilience. Bayezid I's reign from 1389 to 1402 represented the next stage of Ottoman centralization and ambition. Where Murad had consolidated, Bayezid sought to unify and dominate. His swift and decisive leadership earned him his epithet. He began by securing the Balkans, reaffirming the vassalage of Serbia and extending Ottoman influence into Bulgaria and Thessaly. In 1393, he captured Tarnovo, the Bulgarian capital, ending the Second Bulgarian Empire. By the end of the century, nearly all of southeastern Europe, from the Danube to the Aegean, recognized Ottoman authority in some form. Bayezid also turned his attention eastward. The fragmentation of Anatolia following the decline of Mongol dominance had left numerous Turkish beyliks vying for territory. Bayezid pursued an aggressive campaign of unification, absorbing principalities such as Karaman, Aydin, and Saruhan. This expansion brought him into conflict with rival Muslim rulers, but also strengthened the empire's economic and military resources. For the first time, the Ottomans controlled both the Anatolian heartland and the European frontier, transforming the Sultanate into a true imperial power straddling two continents. Internally, Bayezid continued the centralizing reforms begun under Murad. He reinforced the authority of the Sultan as the ultimate arbiter of power, reducing the autonomy of the frontier lords. The Timar system was expanded and standardized, ensuring a steady supply of cavalry while binding landholding to loyalty. The Janissary Corps, now a permanent standing army, became the Sultan's primary instrument of enforcement. Bayezid's reliance on this elite force reflected the growing sophistication of the Ottoman military state, one capable of rapid mobilization, disciplined coordination, and logistical endurance. Bayezid's court at Edirne reflected the empire's increasing grandeur. Chroniclers describe a sultan deeply committed to the symbols of authority, elaborate ceremonies, architectural projects, and the assertion of royal dignity. The construction of the Bayezid Mosque and other civic works demonstrated his vision of an empire rooted in both faith and order. Scholars, jurists, and poets gathered at his court, marking the emergence of Ottoman intellectual life as a distinct tradition. Persian and Arabic influences blended with Turkic literary forms, producing a cultural synthesis that mirrored the empire's political inclusivity. Diplomatically, Bayezid's ambitions extended beyond consolidation. His forces besieged Constantinople twice, in 1394 and 1399, encircling the Byzantine capital and cutting off its supplies. The city survived only through the intervention of Western powers, who viewed its fall as the loss of a Christian bastion. The sieges demonstrated Ottoman logistical capability and naval expansion, but they also exposed the limits of sustained warfare in the face of growing European resistance. The Byzantine Empire, though diminished, remained a symbolic and strategic prize, one that would eventually fall under Bayezid's great-grandson, Mehmed II. The apex of Bayezid's reign came with his confrontation against the Hungarian-led Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396. This coalition of European nobles, urged by the papacy, sought to reverse Ottoman expansion in the Balkans. The battle, fought near the Danube, ended in a crushing Ottoman victory. Bayezid's disciplined forces routed the disorganized Crusader army, capturing thousands of prisoners. The triumph confirmed Ottoman dominance in southeastern Europe and demonstrated the military superiority of their combined cavalry and janissary forces. For contemporaries, it symbolized the decline of feudal warfare and the rise of centralized, professional armies. Yet Bayezid's rapid expansion contained the seeds of vulnerability. His assertive campaigns in Anatolia alarmed Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror who sought to re-establish a universal empire from Central Asia to the Middle East. The clash between the two powers was perhaps inevitable. Both rulers claimed legitimacy as unifiers of the Muslim world, and both relied on military strength and divine sanction to justify their rule. Their conflict represented not just a contest of arms, but of political visions, one rooted in frontier synthesis, the other in steppe imperial tradition. The confrontation culminated at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. Bayezid's forces, though formidable, were stretched across two continents and burdened by recent campaigns. Timur's army, experienced and disciplined, outmaneuvered the Ottomans near the city of Ankara. The heat, the disorganization of Bayezid's contingents, and the defection of some Anatolian allies contributed to disaster. The Ottoman army was annihilated, and Bayezid himself was captured. His death in captivity a few months later plunged the empire into crisis. The defeat at Ankara was a profound shock. For the first time in their history, the Ottomans faced near dissolution. The centralized structure built by Orhan, Murad, and Bayezid fractured as Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, fought for succession. This period, known as the interregnum, would last over a decade, testing the very foundations of Ottoman endurance. Yet even in disarray, the administrative framework held. Local governors, religious endowments, and the Timur system continued to function. The empire had grown deep enough roots to survive the absence of a ruler. The reigns of Murad I and Bayezid I thus defined the essential character of the Ottoman state. Murad gave it its European dimension and institutional stability. Bayezid endowed it with imperial ambition and central authority. Together, their legacies forged the dual identity that would sustain the empire for centuries: Anatolian and Balkan, Islamic and pragmatic, militarized yet bureaucratic. The defeat at Ankara did not erase their achievements. It merely paused their momentum. The empire would recover, reorganize, and emerge stronger under Bayezid's son, Mehmed I. As the dust settled over the Anatolian plains, a new generation of leaders began to rebuild what had been momentarily broken. The lessons of expansion and collapse were absorbed into the empire's political memory. Discipline, legitimacy, and flexibility had carried the Ottomans from a small frontier principality to the edge of continental power. They would soon need those same qualities again to restore unity and resume the march toward empire. The fall of Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 marked one of the darkest moments in Ottoman history. The empire that had seemed destined for imperial greatness was abruptly broken apart by the thunderous advance of Timur's armies. The Sultan himself was captured, his capital overrun, and his sons scattered across the remnants of a fractured dominion. For the first time since Osman's founding generations earlier, the very survival of the Ottoman polity came into question. What followed was a decade of chaos and internal struggle, a period remembered as the Ottoman interregnum. In the aftermath of Ankara, the once cohesive Ottoman state disintegrated into competing zones of authority. Timur, the Central Asian conqueror who claimed to restore the Mongol legacy, dismantled the Ottomans' fragile unity by releasing Bayezid's sons to govern as rival princes. This was no accident. By dividing their inheritance, he ensured that no single heir could immediately rebuild the empire that had challenged him in Anatolia. The Anatolian beyliks that Bayezid had previously absorbed into his centralized structure reasserted their independence, while in the Balkans, vassal rulers and Christian allies seized the moment to recover lost territories. Bayezid's eldest surviving son, Suleiman Çelebi, established his authority in the European provinces. From Edirne, he maintained control over much of Thrace and Macedonia, relying on the loyalty of frontier beys and the pragmatic tolerance of Christian states such as Byzantium and Venice. His position was precarious, resting on fragile alliances and the uncertain support of local notables who valued peace over renewed warfare. Across the straits in Anatolia, another son, Isa Çelebi, attempted to claim Bursa and its surroundings, proclaiming himself ruler of the Anatolian heartland. Yet his position was soon contested by a third brother, Musa, who gathered forces in the east and sought the allegiance of disaffected beyliks. The rivalry between these claimants reflected not merely personal ambition, but also the enduring tension between the empire's two halves, Anatolia and Rumelia. Each region possessed its own military, economic, and social base, and under separate princes, they drifted further apart. For the population living through this turmoil, the decade following Ankara brought economic hardship and political uncertainty. Trade routes were disrupted, tax systems collapsed, and cities once bustling with artisans and merchants suffered decline. The Ottoman administrative structure, carefully built under Murad I and Bayezid I, was severely weakened. Among the surviving princes, Mehmed Çelebi, the youngest, governed the relatively remote region of Amasya in northeastern Anatolia. Isolated from the main centers of conflict, he used this period to rebuild his forces and cultivate alliances with neighboring lords. His patience and pragmatism distinguished him from his more aggressive brothers. Mehmed understood that the future of the dynasty depended on restoring not only territory but also legitimacy. His early rule in Amasya displayed an emerging political intelligence that would later define his reign, a balance between diplomacy, military strategy, and religious patronage. As the brothers maneuvered for dominance, external powers exploited the disarray. The Byzantine Empire, long besieged by Ottoman pressure, now sought to manipulate the rival claimants. Emperor Manuel II Paleologos offered refuge and support to Suleiman in exchange for the return of territories along the Marmara coast. The Venetians and Genoese, dominant in Mediterranean trade, likewise pursued arrangements that ensured their commercial interests remained protected amid Ottoman weakness. Meanwhile, Timur's departure from Anatolia left a power vacuum that the restored Turkish beyliks, such as Karaman, Germian, and Aydin, were eager to fill. In this fractured landscape, alliances shifted with remarkable speed. In 1405, Isa Çelebi was defeated and killed, leaving Suleiman dominant in Europe and Musa and Mehmed struggling for control in Asia. Mehmed gradually consolidated his hold over Anatolia, using cautious diplomacy to neutralize threats from neighboring beyliks. He secured the loyalty of former Ottoman commanders by restoring their timars and emphasizing continuity with the dynasty's early traditions. His growing strength eventually alarmed Suleiman, who in 1410 launched a campaign across the straits to reclaim Anatolia. The resulting clashes marked the first major phase of the interregnum's internal wars. Suleiman's initial successes were short-lived. His forces, stretched between Europe and Asia, could not sustain prolonged conflict. His indulgence in courtly luxury and over-reliance on Byzantine alliances weakened his standing among the frontier warriors who prized discipline and piety. In 1411, Musa, aided by Mehmed's covert support, crossed into Europe and turned Suleiman's allies against him. The decisive confrontation near Edirne ended with Suleiman's death, and Musa assumed control over the European provinces, styling himself sultan. His rule, however, was marked by suspicion and hostility toward the Christian states that had aided his brother. Musa's anti-Byzantine stance reignited regional warfare. He besieged Constantinople, pressuring the emperor who had once been Suleiman's ally. This aggression, while popular among the frontier warriors, alienated other Ottoman elites who valued the pragmatic diplomacy that had previously maintained stability. The conflict revealed a deeper ideological divide within the Ottoman elite, between those who favored expansion through Gaza and those who prioritized administrative restoration. Mehmed, watching events unfold, recognized that Musa's uncompromising approach would soon isolate him. By 1412, Mehmed intervened decisively. Crossing into Europe, he positioned himself as the restorer of balance and order. His campaign combined military precision with political tact. Many of Musa's commanders defected, weary of internal strife. The final battle near Samarkand in 1413 ended the fraternal conflict. Musa was defeated and killed, and Mehmed emerged as the uncontested ruler of both Anatolia and Rumelia. His victory marked the end of the interregnum, a decade of division that had threatened to erase the Ottoman name from history. Once reunited, the empire faced the immense challenge of reconstruction. Mehmed's reign, beginning officially in 1413, was less about conquest and more about consolidation. The physical devastation left by years of war required systematic rebuilding. In both Anatolia and the Balkans, he reinstated governors and judges loyal to the dynasty. He restored agricultural lands disrupted by shifting control and ensured that the Timar system, the the backbone of the Ottoman military economy, functioned again under central supervision. One of Mehmed's most important achievements was the reassertion of religious and moral legitimacy. Recognizing the importance of faith in sustaining unity, he patronized mosques, madrasas, and Sufi lodges, presenting himself as both a just ruler and a servant of divine order. His support for Islamic scholarship extended the intellectual lineage that had begun under Orhan and Murad. By emphasizing continuity, he reassured the learned class, ulama, that the Ottoman mission remained intact despite the turbulence of the preceding decade. Economically, Mehmed faced the arduous task of restoring trade and taxation. He reopened caravan routes between Bursa, Edirne, and the Black Sea ports, re-establishing the commercial lifelines that had once tied the empire's regions together. Under his administration, the minting of new coinage symbolized not only monetary stabilization but also political renewal, the assertion that Ottoman sovereignty was once again whole. Diplomatically, Mehmed navigated a delicate balance between submission and assertion. With Byzantium, he maintained cautious peace, recognizing that internal recovery required stability rather than renewed siege warfare. In Anatolia, he secured alliances with neighboring beyliks through marriage and negotiation rather than conquest. This restrained diplomacy contrasted sharply with Bayezid's aggressive expansion and reflected Mehmed's understanding that endurance required patience. At the same time, Mehmed re-established ties with frontier commanders who had drifted during the interregnum. Their loyalty was critical for defending the empire's borders and projecting authority in newly recovered provinces. He rewarded them through restored privileges but carefully limited their autonomy, ensuring that local power did not again fracture the state. The dual policy of restoration and centralization defined his entire reign. By the later years of Mehmed's rule, the Ottomans had regained both internal stability and external recognition. The chroniclers of the time, such as Sakrullah and Nesri, later portrayed him as the second founder of the dynasty, a ruler who had rescued the Ottoman house from extinction. His efforts did not restore all of Bayezid's conquests, but they re-established the framework of governance, economy, and ideology that would allow his successors to rebuild the empire's ambitions. Beyond his political achievements, Mehmed's era also marked the reawakening of cultural life. The reconstruction of cities such as Bursa and Edirne brought renewed patronage of artisans and scholars. The architectural projects initiated under his direction emphasized modesty and balance rather than imperial grandeur, reflecting a period of healing rather than expansion. In this regard, his reign symbolized a return to foundational values, discipline, justice, and service to the state. As Mehmed aged, he prepared carefully for succession, aware that dynastic continuity was essential to preventing another interregnum. His son, Murad, had been trained in administration and military command, governing Manisa to gain experience. When Mehmed died in 1421, he left behind not a fragmented realm but a functioning, coherent state poised once again for growth. The interregnum thus stands as a pivotal episode in Ottoman history, a moment when disunity threatened annihilation, yet resilience and prudent leadership ensured survival. The experience left a lasting imprint on the dynasty's political culture. It taught future sultans the perils of unchecked expansion, the importance of legitimate succession, and the necessity of balancing the demands of war and governance. Through Mehmed's restoration, the Ottomans regained their sense of purpose. The empire, though chastened, was now wiser. The institutions rebuilt under his guidance would enable his successors to face new challenges, from the resurgence of the Balkan frontiers to renewed contact with the Christian powers of Europe. Under his son Murad II, these foundations would evolve into a new phase of consolidation and conquest, signaling the rebirth of Ottoman imperial ambition on firmer, more disciplined ground. When Mehmed died in 1421, the Ottoman Empire was once again whole, but still fragile. 2 decades of civil war had left its economy strained and its political balance delicate. The state that Mehmed restored was not yet the empire it once aspired to be under Bayezid I. It was, rather, a careful reconstruction, a framework of institutions, loyalties, and administrative habits that required discipline to endure. Into this environment stepped his son, Murad II, a young ruler whose reign would determine whether the Ottomans could transform recovery into renewed strength. Murad's accession began with uncertainty. Though trained in governance at Manisa and experienced in administration, he inherited a throne surrounded by suspicion. Regional governors still remembered the rivalries of the interregnum, and external powers watched closely, testing whether the dynasty's new ruler possessed the authority to hold together his father's fragile achievements. Murad's first years were defined not by conquest, but by defense, of legitimacy, of stability, and of the principle that a single central ruler could once again command both Anatolia and Rumelia. Almost immediately, rebellion challenged his claim. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel II, seeking to regain influence over Ottoman affairs, released a pretender claiming to be another son of Bayezid, known as Mustafa Chalebi. With the support of certain discontented Anatolian beyliks and remnants of Timurid-aligned forces, Mustafa crossed the Dardanelles and stirred unrest in the European provinces. His cause briefly gained traction among local lords weary of taxation and frontier pressures. But Murad's response was swift and calculated. He relied on his father's restored network of loyal commanders, who intercepted the rebels' advance near Bursa. Mustafa's uprising was defeated within months, and his execution in 1422 served as a grim reminder of how fragile Ottoman unity remained. That same year, Murad faced another grave test: the siege of Bursa and the simultaneous attack on Constantinople. A new pretender, Hukuk Mustafa, another relative supported by the Germanids, sought to exploit the chaos by besieging Bursa from Anatolia. Murad, now forced to defend his legitimacy on multiple fronts, divided his forces and personally led the campaign that ended the revolt. The rebellion was crushed and its leaders executed. Yet the incident revealed a critical truth about the post-interregnum state. The Ottoman polity had survived, but it still lacked the unquestioned central authority that would characterize later centuries. In the midst of these struggles, Murad turned his attention toward the empire's borders. In the Balkans, Christian powers were regrouping. The Serbian despotate under Stefan Lazarevic had maintained relative autonomy since the days of Bayezid. Upon Stefan's death in 1427, his successor Durad Brankovic faced renewed Ottoman pressure. Murad reasserted Ottoman suzerainty through calculated diplomacy rather than immediate warfare, confirming vassal obligations while allowing internal autonomy. This balance, firm authority tempered with political accommodation, became a hallmark of Murad's Balkan policy. In Anatolia, Murad pursued consolidation rather than conquest. He reabsorbed the Beylik of Germian through inheritance and secured the allegiance of the Kandarids through diplomatic marriage. Rather than expand recklessly, he strengthened the frontier fortresses along the Black Sea and re-established direct control over Western Anatolia's trade routes. These moves, though less dramatic than battlefield victories, were essential in restoring the economic arteries of the empire. Under Murad's administration, tax registers were standardized, and the Timar system was reorganized to ensure regular revenue for the Sipahi cavalry. Murad's reign also marked the revival of cultural patronage as a tool of legitimacy. In Edirne, which remained the administrative center of the empire, he sponsored new architectural works that reflected both piety and authority. The Muradine Mosque, constructed during his reign, became a model of early Ottoman architectural elegance, simple in form, yet adorned with refined tile work that reflected the synthesis of Anatolian and Balkan artistic traditions. Patronage of scholars and jurists reinforced his image as a just ruler, a man of faith and intellect. However, Murad's peace was not destined to last. The 1430s ushered in a new era of conflict in the Balkans, as European powers, emboldened by Ottoman preoccupation in Anatolia, sought to reclaim lost ground. In 1430, Murad launched a major campaign against Thessaloniki, which had been occupied by Venetian forces. The city's fall to the Ottomans that year reasserted their dominance in Macedonia and reopened the Aegean corridor. The capture of Thessaloniki was more than a military victory. It was a symbol of recovery and renewed confidence, proof that the Ottomans could once again expand under disciplined leadership. The consolidation of the empire under Murad was constantly tested by the shifting alliances of Christian Europe. The Hungarian kingdom, under Sigismund and later Albert II, emerged as the principal adversary. In 1437, open warfare resumed along the Danube frontier. Murad's forces achieved early successes, but the frontier was difficult to hold. Campaigns in Serbia and Wallachia required constant mobilization, straining resources and manpower. Yet Murad understood that total conquest was less important than maintaining a stable frontier buffer. His strategy, therefore, was not annihilation but containment, ensuring that rival powers remained divided and that the Balkans continued to serve as both a defense and a source of tribute. The early 1440s brought the most dramatic test of Murad's reign, the Crusade of Varna. Encouraged by the papacy and led by King Ladislaw III of Poland and Hungary, the crusading army sought to expel the Ottomans from Europe. The campaign was ambitious, uniting Hungarian, Polish, Wallachian, and papal contingents under the banner of Christendom. Murad, by contrast, had just abdicated temporarily in favor of his young son Mehmed, retreating to Manisa for religious seclusion. The sudden threat forced him to return to command. In 1444, at Varna on the Black Sea coast, Murad led the Ottoman army in one of the decisive confrontations of the 15th century. The battle demonstrated both his experience and the effectiveness of the restructured Ottoman military. The Janissaries, disciplined and centrally controlled, held the center, while the Sipahis encircled the crusading flanks. King Ladislaw was killed in combat, and the crusading army collapsed. The victory at Varna reaffirmed Ottoman supremacy in southeastern Europe and restored Murad's authority beyond question. It was also a symbolic reversal of Ankara. A generation after disaster, the empire had once again defeated a pan-European coalition. Yet even after such triumph, Murad's leadership remained defined by moderation. Rather than pursue immediate expansion, he returned to consolidating his frontiers. The following years saw renewed conflict in Serbia and the capture of Novo Brd in 1448, securing access to the region's rich silver mines. Murad's policies combined military assertiveness with administrative prudence, emphasizing the stability that would enable his successors to embark on grander conquests. Throughout his reign, Murad displayed an acute understanding of the balance between warfare and governance. He was neither a reckless conqueror nor a passive ruler. His focus on institutional strength, the judiciary, tax registers, and the training of his son Mehmed ensured that the Ottoman state developed resilience. In this sense, Murad's rule can be seen as the final phase of consolidation before the classical imperial age. The systems refined under his authority, the Timur economy, the Janissary corps, the bureaucratic scribal offices, became the administrative skeleton of the empire for centuries to come. Murad's personal character influenced his approach to rulership. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as devout, reflective, and sometimes withdrawn. Unlike Bayezid I's flamboyant energy, Murad ruled with restraint. He was deeply influenced by the Sufi orders of Anatolia, particularly the Mevlevi and Bahrami traditions, which emphasized humility and balance. His spiritual inclination contributed to his decision to abdicate twice during his reign, first in 1444 and again briefly later, each time returning to power when crisis demanded. This rhythm between retreat and duty reflected a ruler who viewed sovereignty as a burden of responsibility rather than a pursuit of glory. The internal stability of Murad's later years allowed for renewed cultural synthesis across the empire. In Edirne, the imperial court attracted poets, jurists, and scholars from Persia, Anatolia, and the Balkans. Ottoman administrative language matured during this period, blending Persianate elegance with Turkish clarity. The chancery manuals of this era reveal the growing professionalism of scribes and bureaucrats who managed the expanding state. The fusion of Islamic legal norms with pragmatic governance created the Ottoman administrative ethos that would reach its peak in the 16th century. Murad's campaigns in Albania against the resistance led by Skanderbeg marked another enduring episode of his rule. Beginning in 1443, the Albanian revolt, supported intermittently by Venice and Hungary, became a persistent challenge. Though Murad's forces regained control of several fortresses, complete pacification proved elusive. The conflict demonstrated the difficulties of maintaining authority over mountainous terrain and fragmented local societies. Nevertheless, the Albanian campaigns refined Ottoman military logistics, strengthening their capacity to conduct prolonged operations in Europe. By the late 1440s, the empire had regained both strength and confidence. Murad's military victories, economic reforms, and administrative consolidation transformed the fragile realm he inherited into a cohesive state. His reign was not characterized by spectacular expansion, but by the steady, disciplined reconstruction of imperial capacity. When he died in 1451, he left his son Mehmed II not only a united empire, but also the tools and institutions necessary for global ambition. Murad's legacy lies in the stability he created after decades of turmoil. He had witnessed firsthand the dangers of fraternal strife and unrestrained conquest. His deliberate policies ensured that the Ottoman state would never again face an interregnum of equal magnitude. He redefined the balance between military power and bureaucratic order, between the ruler's charisma and the authority of law. The significance of Murad's reign extends beyond its immediate achievements. It marks the bridge between the medieval sultanate and the imperial order that would emerge under his son. The systems of taxation, the professional army, the architectural and literary culture, all these elements matured under Murad's cautious but effective rule. His ability to transform restoration into resilience stands as one of the most consequential achievements in Ottoman history. As the 15th century reached its midpoint, the empire that had once nearly vanished was now stronger than ever. Its armies were disciplined, its treasury organized, its administration codified. The stage was set for a new generation, a ruler who would carry Ottoman ambition beyond restoration into triumph. When Mehmed II ascended the throne in 1451, he inherited from his father not chaos but coherence, not recovery but readiness. The empire was prepared, its vision clear, to unite East and West, Islam and empire, past and future, in the enduring form of a global power. The coming chapter would open with a single monumental act, the conquest of Constantinople. But beneath that moment of glory lay the foundation carefully built by Murad II, an empire restored not by conquest alone, but by discipline, patience, and an unyielding sense of order. When Murad II died in 1451, the empire he left behind was disciplined and whole. The institutions of power, rebuilt over decades of careful rule, now passed to his son Mehmed, a young man of just 19. Yet behind the calm of succession lay immense expectation. The Ottoman state had survived collapse, restored its unity, and regained its strength. What remained was to transform that strength into permanence, to turn a regional power into an empire that could stand beside, or above, the ancient realms of Byzantium and Persia. Mehmed's reign would fulfill that transformation, beginning with the act that defined not only his life but the trajectory of the Ottoman world, the conquest of Constantinople. Mehmed's early years prepared him for the dual nature of rulership, military command, and intellectual vision. Trained by scholars such as Aksim Seddin and the philosopher Molla Gurani, he possessed a sharp curiosity about science, history, and theology. He studied Persian, Arabic, Greek, and Latin, and was fascinated by the legacies of both Islamic and Roman governance. His education reflected a deliberate design to mold a ruler capable of uniting East and West under one sovereign system. Yet for all his intellectual depth, Mehmed's youth also drew skepticism. When he first ascended the throne during his father's temporary abdication in 1444, senior officials had doubted his readiness. Now, in 1451, as he took power again, those doubts lingered. The Byzantine Empire, though reduced to a narrow strip of territory around Constantinople, still stood as a symbolic rival. The city, with its massive Theodosian walls and storied history, represented the continuity of Roman civilization. For the Ottomans, whose dominions surrounded it on all sides, its presence was both an obstacle and a provocation. To rule from Edirne was to govern from the periphery. To rule from Constantinople would be to govern from the heart of empire. Mehmed understood this not only as a military necessity, but as a statement of destiny. His intentions became clear within months of his accession. While maintaining the appearance of diplomacy, he began preparing the logistical and administrative groundwork for a massive campaign. The construction of the fortress Rumeli Hizari on the European shore of the Bosporus in 1452 sent an unmistakable signal. Built directly opposite the earlier Anadolu Hizari, it allowed Ottoman control over the strait, severing Byzantine access to the Black Sea. The fortress's completion in just 4 months demonstrated the efficiency of Mehmed's administration and the discipline of his engineers. It was both a military installation and a declaration that the conquest of Constantinople was no longer a matter of speculation, but imminent policy. Internally, Mehmed secured his authority with decisive measures. He reaffirmed the loyalty of provincial governors through appointments and stipends, but also removed or executed those whose allegiance was uncertain. Among his most trusted advisors was Grand Vizier Kandarli Halil Pasha, a figure of immense experience but cautious temperament. Halil Pasha urged restraint, fearing the risks of besieging such a formidable city. Mehmed listened but was unmoved. The young sultan's vision extended beyond the calculations of risk. He saw in Constantinople the key to imperial unity and historical immortality. Preparations for the siege began on an unprecedented scale. Ottoman engineers, drawing upon knowledge from both Islamic and European traditions, developed new artillery capable of breaching even the strongest walls. The Hungarian cannon founder Urban was employed to cast massive bronze bombards, among the largest ever constructed. Supply depots were established across Thrace, and roads were repaired to ensure continuous movement of troops and provisions. The navy, newly expanded, was ordered to blockade the city from the Sea of Marmara and the Golden Horn. By the spring of 1453, the Ottoman army, numbering perhaps 80,000 regulars and auxiliaries, encircled Constantinople. The defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, could muster fewer than 10,000 men, including Genoese mercenaries under Giovanni Giustiniani. The disparity was vast, yet the city's fortifications, standing for 1,000 years, remained formidable. The triple line of the Theodosian walls, supported by deep moats and towers, had withstood sieges by Persians, Arabs, and Bulgarians. Mehmed faced not merely a military obstacle, but a legend of invincibility. The siege began on April 6, 1453. For nearly 7 weeks, the Ottomans maintained relentless pressure. The great cannon opened fire, shaking the earth with each discharge, gradually weakening the outer defenses. Engineers filled moats, constructed siege towers, and launched repeated assaults. At sea, the Byzantine defenders blocked the Golden Horn with a heavy chain, preventing direct naval attack. In response, Mehmed executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers in medieval warfare. On the night of April 21st, he ordered dozens of ships hauled overland on greased planks from the Bosporus into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely. When the defenders awoke to find the Ottoman fleet inside the harbor, their morale faltered. Throughout the siege, Mehmed combined force with negotiation. He offered the emperor terms of surrender, safe passage, and honorable treatment, in exchange for yielding the city. Constantine XI refused, declaring his intention to die defending the legacy of his ancestors. The final assault came at dawn on May 29, 1453. After a night of bombardment, Ottoman infantry launched waves of attacks along the walls. The Janissaries, disciplined and relentless, advanced last, breaking through the breaches near the gate of St. Romanus. Emperor Constantine fell in battle, his body later unrecognizable among the dead. By midday, the city that had stood for over a millennium as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire was in Ottoman hands. The capture of Constantinople marked a civilizational turning point. For the Ottomans, it was both culmination and beginning. Mehmed entered the city solemnly, forbidding indiscriminate destruction and ordering protection for the Christian populace who remained. He prayed in the Hagia Sophia, which was converted into the principal imperial mosque, symbolizing the transformation of the city from Byzantine to Ottoman sovereignty. Yet his policies toward the city's inhabitants were pragmatic rather than purely religious. To repopulate the capital, he invited Muslims, Christians, and Jews from across the empire, granting them property and privileges. Within a generation, Constantinople, now called Istanbul, became one of the most diverse and vibrant urban centers of the early modern world. The conquest fundamentally altered the Ottoman conception of rulership. Mehmed no longer styled himself merely as Sultan or Bey. He adopted the title Kaiser-i Rome, Caesar of Rome, claiming succession not only to Islamic dynasties but to the Roman imperial tradition itself. This synthesis of identities, Turkish, Islamic, and Roman, formed the ideological foundation of his empire. The Ottoman ruler was now presented as a universal sovereign, heir to both the caliphate's spiritual authority and the Roman legacy of temporal governance. Post-conquest policies reflected this imperial vision. Mehmed reorganized the empire's administrative hierarchy to match its expanded scale. The Divan-i Humayun, or Imperial Council, was strengthened as the central institution of governance. Provincial governors were appointed not merely for loyalty, but for competence in taxation and law. The military, reorganized around the Janissary Corps and the Timar system, became a model of efficiency. The new capital served as both a political and cultural magnet, drawing scholars, artisans, and administrators from across the Islamic world. Architecturally, Mehmed began transforming Istanbul into an imperial capital worthy of its new status. The construction of the Topkapi Palace overlooking the Golden Horn established the seat of government, a complex blending Islamic, Byzantine, and Persian influences. Surrounding it, new mosques, markets, and educational institutions reflected a deliberate effort to recreate the urban grandeur that had once defined the Byzantine capital. Under Mehmed's patronage, the city became a center of art, scholarship, and administration, embodying the fusion of spiritual and temporal authority. Diplomatically, Mehmed's conquest reverberated across Europe. The fall of Constantinople shocked Christian kingdoms, prompting renewed calls for crusade, though none achieved significant effect. Venice and Genoa, whose trade networks depended on Eastern access, adapted pragmatically, signing commercial treaties with the Ottomans. The papacy decried the loss as a catastrophe, yet within decades, even Italian humanists began to correspond with the Sultan's court, intrigued by his patronage of learning. Mehmed's ambitions, however, extended far beyond Constantinople. The conquest of the Byzantine capital was but the first act in a larger vision of unifying the Eastern Mediterranean. Over the following decades, he embarked on campaigns across the Balkans and Anatolia. Serbia was fully annexed in 1459, followed by the conquest of the Greek despotate of Morea in 1460. In 1461, the Empire of Trebizond, the last Byzantine remnant on the Black Sea, fell to his armies. With its capture, the Byzantine political lineage ended, and Ottoman control stretched unbroken from the Danube to the Taurus Mountains. In Anatolia, Mehmed subdued the Karamanid Principality, whose rulers had long resisted Ottoman encroachment. His campaigns there emphasized the centralization of authority over the patchwork of Turkish beyliks that had survived since Seljuk times. Each conquest reinforced the principle that all power in Anatolia flowed from Istanbul. Through systematic incorporation, Mehmed transformed the region from a mosaic of semi-independent states into a coherent imperial heartland. His European campaigns aimed at expanding influence along the Danube and the Adriatic. Bosnia fell under Ottoman control in 1463, followed by Albania's gradual subjugation after years of resistance under Skanderbeg. Mehmed's forces reached as far as Otranto in southern Italy by 1480, establishing a brief foothold that symbolized his intent to project Ottoman power into the very heart of Europe. Though the Italian campaign was short-lived, it demonstrated the reach of his ambition and the logistical capacity of his reformed military system. Culturally and intellectually, Mehmed's court became a center of Renaissance in its own right. He invited scholars from Persia, Egypt, and the Greek world, commissioning translations of classical works into Arabic and Turkish. The Sultan's personal library contained volumes on philosophy, geography, and astronomy. Mehmed's interest in science led him to patronize the scholar Ali Kushji, who advanced astronomical studies within the Ottoman realm. This engagement with knowledge was not ornamental. It reflected the Sultan's belief that imperial governance required understanding of both divine law and worldly science. The codification of law under Mehmed further strengthened the empire's administrative coherence. His Kanun-i Ali Osman, or legal code, organized the relationship between Sharia law and state regulations, defining taxation, land tenure, and criminal justice. This synthesis between Islamic jurisprudence and pragmatic governance became a defining feature of Ottoman political culture. The Sultan was thus both protector of faith and legislator of order, a balance that lent the empire remarkable stability. Despite his intellectual pursuits, Mehmed's reign was also marked by constant warfare. His campaigns in Wallachia brought him into confrontation with Vlad III, known in European chronicles as Vlad the Impaler. The brutal nature of this conflict, raids, reprisals, and displays of violence, revealed the limits of frontier diplomacy. Yet even here, Mehmed's goal was not destruction but integration. Each province subdued was absorbed into the administrative machinery of the empire, its elites co-opted, its revenues redirected to sustain imperial expansion. By the late 1470s, Mehmed's empire spanned 3 continents. From the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Black Sea to the Aegean, the Ottoman state now governed a vast and diverse population. The integration of these territories required both flexibility and control. Provincial autonomy was balanced by centralized oversight. Religious communities retained internal authority under the millet system, which granted them self-governance in matters of faith and law. This policy of managed pluralism allowed the Ottomans to rule over Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike without imposing uniformity, ensuring loyalty through pragmatic coexistence. The transformation of the Ottoman state under Mehmed II was thus more than territorial. It was conceptual. He reshaped the idea of empire itself, from a federation of frontier beyliks into a universal monarchy with codified law, bureaucracy, and ideology. His reign combined the legacy of Islamic sultanate with the political philosophy of empire, as understood from antiquity. The Ottoman ruler became the axis around which the world was imagined to turn, a caliph in spirit, a Caesar in title, and a philosopher in intellect. As Mehmed aged, his ambition remained undiminished. He prepared new campaigns toward Italy and the East, envisioning the conquest of Rome and the subjugation of Aq-Koinlu in Persia. Yet in 1481, before these plans could be realized, he fell ill during a campaign near Gebze and died at the age of 49. His death marked the end of a reign that had defined an epoch. The empire he left was no longer a regional power. It was a global entity, administratively sophisticated, militarily dominant, and ideologically self-assured. The legacy of Mehmed II endures not only in the monuments he built or the lands he conquered, but in the political culture he forged. He established the imperial model that his successors would refine, the disciplined hierarchy, the legal dualism, and the vision of a state that transcended ethnicity and geography. Under his rule, the Ottoman Empire became both heir and innovator, linking the classical and medieval worlds to the modern age. The conquest of Constantinople had been a moment of transformation. Its aftermath was the beginning of empire. From its walls, now crowned by minarets, radiated a new order that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. In the decades that followed, Mehmed's successors would expand this order into Europe, North Africa, and Asia, carrying forward his imperial vision. When historians look back upon the 15th century, they see in Mehmed II not merely a conqueror, but a constructor of civilizations. His reign fused ambition with administration, faith with rationality, and tradition with innovation. The empire that emerged from his leadership was both a continuation of the Islamic Caliphate and a rebirth of Roman universality. It was an empire not only of armies but of institutions, of law, architecture, and scholarship. As the century closed, the Ottoman banner flew over cities that once belonged to empires long vanished. In the rebuilt streets of Istanbul, scholars debated philosophy, artisans perfected craft, and bureaucrats governed in the name of a dynasty that now claimed the mantle of world rule. Mehmed II's vision had materialized, the fusion of East and West, embodied in a single state, sustained by faith, order, and learning. From the ashes of Byzantium rose a new civilization, Ottoman, Islamic, and imperial, whose influence would shape the course of history for the next 5 centuries. The conquest of Constantinople had not ended an era, it had begun one. When Mehmed II died in 1481, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads between expansion and consolidation. His reign had redrawn the political geography of the Eastern Mediterranean, but the pace of conquest had outstripped the empire's capacity for internal absorption. The administrative machinery, though advanced, was stretched across diverse territories and populations. Into this complex inheritance stepped his son, Bayezid II, a ruler of markedly different temperament. Where Mehmed embodied conquest and construction, Bayezid would represent stabilization and governance. His era was not defined by dramatic wars or sweeping architectural projects, but by a quieter process of integration, an empire learning to manage the vast domains it now controlled. Bayezid's accession was neither uncontested nor assured. Upon his father's death, the succession crisis revealed underlying tensions within the imperial household and military elite. His brother Sem Sultan, governor of Karaman, claimed the throne with support from certain provincial factions and elements of the Janissary Corps. The struggle that followed, lasting several years, exposed the delicate balance between dynastic legitimacy and military loyalty that underpinned Ottoman rule. Bayezid, backed by the capital's administrators and the religious establishment, ultimately prevailed, forcing Sem to flee to Rhodes under the protection of the Knights Hospitaller and later into the custody of the papacy. This episode had far-reaching implications, intertwining Ottoman politics with European diplomacy for decades. Western rulers viewed Sem as a potential lever against the empire, while Bayezid, mindful of the threat, paid substantial sums to ensure his brother remained safely detained. The resolution of the succession crisis allowed Bayezid to turn inward. His reign began with a deliberate shift in emphasis, from the expansionism of his father to the consolidation of governance. This was not merely a matter of temperament, but a structural necessity. The empire now stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, encompassing Balkan Christians, Anatolian Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and others. The challenge before Bayezid was to transform this diversity into coherent administration without undermining the central authority that Mehmed had forged. One of his earliest initiatives was the reorganization of provincial administration. Bayezid expanded the Timar system, land grants in exchange for military service, ensuring that provincial cavalry remained tied to the Sultan's authority. Yet he also sought to curb the autonomy of provincial governors who, under the pressures of frontier warfare, had accumulated semi-independent power. Through a steady policy of appointments, audits, and legal codification, he reaffirmed the principle that all administrative authority derived from the central Divan-i-Humayun. The provincial defters, or tax registers, were revised to reflect new land distributions, standardizing fiscal obligations and clarifying jurisdictional boundaries. This process of bureaucratic calibration was slow but transformative, anchoring the Ottoman state in a stable administrative rhythm that would endure through the 16th century. Bayezid's reign also marked a turning point in the relationship between religion and politics within the empire. Whereas Mehmed II had emphasized imperial universality, blending Islamic and Roman ideals, Bayezid leaned toward the consolidation of the Islamic character of the state. His personal piety, reflected in his sobriquet Bayezid-i Veli, Bayezid the Saintly, shaped his policies toward law, education, and endowment. He patronized religious scholars, expanded the network of madrises, and reinforced the authority of the ulama as interpreters of Islamic law. This shift did not diminish the secular power of the Sultan but rebalanced it, embedding imperial governance more deeply within Islamic legal and moral frameworks. The Sharia courts were expanded across provincial centers, providing consistency in judicial practice and integrating the empire's diverse populations under a shared system of adjudication. Fiscal stability was a constant concern. The wars of Mehmed II had strained the treasury, and Bayezid inherited an economy in need of recalibration. His response was methodical. Through comprehensive land surveys and tax reforms, he increased regular revenue without resorting to heavy extraordinary levies. The iltizam system, tax farming, was refined to prevent abuse and ensure predictable income. Bayezid also emphasized infrastructure and trade. He invested in caravan routes, bridges, and urban markets, recognizing that a functioning economy was the foundation of imperial durability. Under his rule, cities such as Bursa, Edirne, and Istanbul thrived as commercial hubs linking Europe, Anatolia, and the Middle East. The minting of standardized coinage and regulation of weights and measures further stabilized the economic system. Culturally, Bayezid presided over a period of intellectual and artistic consolidation. The court of Mehmed II had drawn scholars from across the Islamic world. Bayezid's court continued this patronage, but in a more introspective, religiously oriented manner. He commissioned Quran manuscripts, sponsored calligraphers, and supported the architectural projects that defined the Ottoman classical aesthetic. The Bayezid Mosque complex in Istanbul, completed in 1506, reflected this synthesis of function and devotion, a combination of worship, education, and social welfare. Its attached hospital and kitchen served both spiritual and civic purposes, embodying the Ottoman principle that governance included the care of the community. One of the most remarkable aspects of Bayezid's reign was his policy toward refugees and displaced populations. Following the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492, he invited thousands to settle within Ottoman lands. His decision, often cited as an example of Ottoman pragmatism, was driven by both humanitarian and strategic reasoning. The Jewish exiles brought with them skills in trade, finance, and medicine that enriched the empire's urban economy. Cities such as Salonika and Istanbul became centers of Sephardic life, their communities integrated under the millet system, which granted religious autonomy in exchange for loyalty to the state. This act of inclusion reinforced the empire's cosmopolitan character and demonstrated Bayezid's understanding of diversity as a source of strength rather than vulnerability. Externally, Bayezid's foreign policy was characterized by caution and balance. He avoided large-scale wars, preferring diplomacy and defense to conquest. Yet his reign was not without conflict. In the east, he confronted the rising power of the Safavids under Shah Ismail, whose militant Sharia movement threatened both Ottoman borders and Sunni orthodoxy. The spread of Safavid influence into eastern Anatolia posed a dual challenge, political and sectarian. Bayezid responded through a combination of military fortification and ideological countermeasures. He strengthened frontier garrisons and promoted Sunni scholarship to counter Safavid propaganda. This contest would later culminate in open warfare under his son Selim, but under Bayezid it remained a managed tension, indicative of his cautious, administrative approach. In the west, the Venetian Republic remained the principal maritime rival. The Ottoman-Venetian War of 1499 to 1503, though limited in scope, reaffirmed Ottoman naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. Under Admiral Kemal Reis, the Ottoman fleet employed advanced gunnery and maneuvering techniques, capturing strategic positions such as Modin, Coron, and Lepanto. These victories demonstrated the growing sophistication of the Ottoman navy, which under Bayezid's patronage evolved from a regional force into a professional maritime arm of the state. The war's conclusion through treaty preserved Ottoman control of key Aegean and Ionian ports, securing trade routes and reinforcing Istanbul's status as the commercial center of the eastern Mediterranean. Despite his focus on consolidation, Bayezid did not neglect cultural diplomacy. He maintained correspondence with rulers across Europe and the Islamic world, exchanging gifts and envoys with the Mamluks, Venetians, and even the Italian city-states. His reign coincided with the early Renaissance, And though the Ottoman world followed its own intellectual trajectory, there were subtle exchanges in art, science, and cartography. The works of the Ottoman admiral and geographer Piri Reis, who compiled detailed maps and navigational charts, reflected the growing synthesis of Islamic and European knowledge traditions. These intellectual crosscurrents underscored the empire's integration into a wider world system of exchange and discovery. At home, Bayezid faced the ongoing task of maintaining balance between the Janissaries and the traditional cavalry aristocracy. The expansion of the Devshirme system, through which Christian youths were recruited into the imperial service, had created a core loyal to the Sultan but potentially volatile in moments of succession or discontent. Bayezid managed this tension through regular pay increases, ceremonial honors, and strict discipline. His cautious temperament and reliance on bureaucratic mediation prevented open rebellion, but the underlying dynamic, the military's growing political influence, remained a structural feature of Ottoman governance. The later years of Bayezid's reign were increasingly shaped by the question of succession. His sons, particularly Ahmed and Selim, engaged in political maneuvering that mirrored the conflict of his own youth. The struggle reflected differing visions of the empire's future. Ahmed represented continuity of Bayezid's cautious administration, while Selim embodied a more militant, expansive outlook. As Safavid power grew in the east, Selim's argument for a stronger military response gained traction within the army. Bayezid, aging and increasingly isolated within the palace, sought to manage the conflict through appointments and mediation, but by 1512, the balance had shifted decisively in Selim's favor. Pressured by the Janissaries, Bayezid abdicated in favor of his son and died shortly thereafter while en route to retirement in Dimitoka. Bayezid II's three-decade reign left a legacy of equilibrium. He did not conquer new empires, but he made empire governable. Under his leadership, the Ottoman state transitioned from a phase of territorial accumulation to one of institutional maturity. The financial systems, legal structures, and provincial hierarchies he refined would serve as the foundation for the empire's 16th-century zenith under Selim and Suleiman. His reign demonstrated that imperial longevity depended not only on conquest, but on administration, not only on military strength, but on the disciplined application of law and fiscal prudence. In retrospect, Bayezid's policies reveal a deep understanding of sustainability in governance. His avoidance of reckless expansion prevented the overextension that had undermined many empires before his. His emphasis on learning and piety nurtured a cultural environment where religion and reason coexisted in statecraft. His acceptance of diverse populations established the Ottoman pattern of pragmatic tolerance, ensuring internal cohesion across religious and ethnic lines. Even his apparent conservatism served a purpose. By tempering the imperial machine built by his father, he ensured its readiness for the next stage of transformation. Historians often characterize Bayezid as a transitional ruler, a bridge between two great conquerors, Mehmed II and Selim I. Yet this characterization understates his significance. His reign was the necessary interlude of consolidation that gave the Ottoman Empire its classical form. It was during his years that the empire's administrative systems crystallized, its capital matured, and its fiscal foundations were laid with precision. His prudence ensured that when the time for renewed expansion came, the state would possess the institutional resilience to sustain it. As the 16th century dawned, the Ottoman world stood poised for another era of transformation. The religious conflicts of the East, the maritime contests of the Mediterranean, and the ambitions of a new generation of sultans would soon propel the empire into its imperial zenith. But beneath those future triumphs lay the steady architecture of governance that Bayezid II had constructed, a system of laws, officials, and ideas that turned conquest into civilization. When Bayezid II abdicated in 1512, the Ottoman Empire stood at the height of internal order but the threshold of external transformation. For nearly half a century, the empire had been a power of two worlds, European and Anatolian, anchored in stability and methodical governance. Yet by the early 16th century, the Islamic world beyond its borders was in upheaval. In the East, The Safavid dynasty had established a militant Shura state in Persia, proclaiming allegiance to the 12 imams and challenging the Sunni orthodoxy that underpinned Ottoman legitimacy. In the south, the Mamluk Sultanate still ruled Egypt and Syria, maintaining control of the holy cities and the lucrative trade routes connecting the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The world that Bayezid had kept at arm's length was now pressing against Ottoman borders with religious, political, and commercial force. It was into this shifting landscape that his son, Selim, ascended the throne, determined to redefine the empire not as a regional power, but as the preeminent state of the Islamic world. Selim, later known as Yavuz, the Stern, was a ruler of immense will and clarity of purpose. His rise to power was marked by swift and ruthless action. Born in Amasya and educated in both the administrative and military traditions of the empire, he possessed the discipline of a commander and the analytical mind of a strategist. His path to the throne was neither peaceful nor straightforward. Upon Bayezid's abdication, several of Selim's brothers remained potential claimants, supported by regional factions within the army and provincial elites. Selim acted with decisive speed, eliminating rivals and consolidating authority through a mixture of political calculation and military coercion. His methods, though severe, restored the singular command that the Ottoman state required to face its external challenges. The empire Selim inherited was well organized but cautious. The empire he would create was dynamic and expansive. His reign lasted only 8 years, yet within that short span, the Ottomans would expand farther and faster than in any comparable period of their history. Through conquest, diplomacy, and ideological assertion, Selim redefined the empire's geopolitical position. It would no longer be one power among many in the Islamic world. It would become its center. The first and most urgent challenge came from the east. The Safavid dynasty, founded by Shah Ismail in 1501, had rapidly transformed from a Sufi order into a militant theocracy. Its expansion across Iran and into eastern Anatolia alarmed both political and religious leaders in the Ottoman domains. The Safavids promoted a messianic form of Shurism that directly contradicted the Sunni orthodoxy upheld by the Ottomans and attracted converts among the Turkmen tribes of Anatolia, many of whom resented Ottoman centralization and taxation. By the time Selim took the throne, Safavid missionaries and sympathizers had spread across central and eastern Anatolia, destabilizing key provinces. Selim viewed this not merely as a political threat, but as a crisis of legitimacy. The Ottomans had long presented themselves as the defenders of Sunni Islam and heirs to the universal caliphate. The rise of a rival Islamic empire with a competing doctrine undermined this claim. Before confronting external enemies, Selim first turned inward, ordering a thorough investigation of Anatolian provinces suspected of harboring Safavid sympathizers. The measures were harsh: arrests, relocations, and, in some cases, executions followed. This purge, while severe, reasserted control over the eastern frontier and demonstrated Selim's uncompromising stance on unity of faith and authority. Having secured his domestic base, Selim prepared for direct confrontation with Shah Ismail. The campaign that followed was one of the most significant military operations of the early modern era. In the spring of 1514, Selim led an army of nearly 100,000 men across Anatolia toward the Persian frontier. Logistics were formidable. Long supply lines stretched across sparsely populated terrain, and the rugged highlands of eastern Anatolia posed constant challenges. Yet the Ottoman army was better equipped and more disciplined than any the Safavids could field. The core of Selim's force consisted of janissaries armed with matchlock muskets and supported by field artillery, a combination that represented the cutting edge of early modern warfare. The confrontation came at Calderon, near the modern Iranian border, in August 1514. The battle was brief but decisive. Shah Ismail's forces, famed for their cavalry and religious zeal, charged directly into the Ottoman lines, only to be met by disciplined volleys of gunfire and devastating cannon fire. The Safavid army, lacking artillery and modern infantry tactics, was overwhelmed. Shah Ismail himself narrowly escaped, his aura of invincibility shattered. The victory at Calderon was not merely a battlefield triumph, but a geopolitical turning point. It established the Ottomans as the dominant military power of the Islamic world and demonstrated the superiority of gunpowder-based warfare over traditional cavalry. Selim entered the Safavid capital of Tabriz shortly thereafter. Though his stay was brief, it marked the first Ottoman penetration into Iran and symbolized the empire's claim to supremacy in the east. Tabriz's artisans and scholars were relocated to Ottoman lands, enriching the empire's cultural and technical base. The campaign also exposed the limits of expansion. Supply shortages and the exhaustion of the troops forced Selim to withdraw before consolidating full control. Yet strategically, the outcome was decisive. The eastern frontier was secured, and the Safavid threat contained for a generation. The victory at Calderon also had profound ideological consequences. Selim now positioned himself as the defender of Sunni Islam against heresy, reinforcing his legitimacy both domestically and abroad. Religious scholars in Istanbul and Cairo hailed his triumph as a divine vindication of orthodoxy. This framing would later underpin his claim to the caliphate, linking military conquest with spiritual authority. Following the campaign in Persia, Selim turned his attention southward, toward the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The Mamluks had ruled since the 13th century, maintaining control over Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, as well as the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Their realm was rich and prestigious, but internally fragmented. The shift in global trade routes, combined with the economic strain of maintaining military dominance, had weakened their hold over the region. To Selim, the Mamluks represented both an opportunity and an obstacle. An opportunity to unite the Islamic world under Ottoman leadership, and an obstacle to that unification so long as they controlled the Holy Lands and the pilgrimage routes. Diplomatic exchanges between Istanbul and Cairo deteriorated rapidly after Calderon. The Mamluks had supported Shah Ismail indirectly and harbored refugees from the Safavid conflict. Selim demanded recognition of his supremacy and the cessation of anti-Ottoman activities. The Mamluks refused. War became inevitable. In 1516, Selim led his army once again across Anatolia, this time heading for Syria. At Marj Dabik, near Aleppo, the Ottoman and Mamluk armies met in one of the pivotal battles of Middle Eastern history. The Mamluks, renowned for their cavalry and individual valor, found themselves at a disadvantage against Ottoman artillery and disciplined infantry formations. The battle ended in decisive Ottoman victory, and the Mamluk Sultan Al-Ghori was killed in combat. With Syria now open, Selim advanced methodically southward. The cities of Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus fell in succession, their local elites pledging allegiance in exchange for stability and protection. The Ottomans demonstrated administrative efficiency in integrating these territories, maintaining existing tax systems while introducing imperial oversight through trusted governors. The conquest of Syria was both military and bureaucratic, a template for Ottoman incorporation of new lands. In early 1517, the campaign moved into Egypt. The Mamluks, now under Sultan Tumen Bey II, mounted a final defense near Cairo at Radania. Once again, Ottoman artillery proved decisive. The Mamluk army was routed, and Cairo was captured. Tumen Bey was later executed, ending over 2.5 centuries of Mamluk rule. The conquest of Egypt transformed the Ottoman Empire from a regional power into the leading state of the Islamic world. Control of the Nile Delta brought immense agricultural wealth. Possession of the Red Sea ports and the Hijaz secured dominance over the pilgrimage and trade routes linking Asia, Africa, and Europe. Equally significant was the symbolic dimension of Selim's triumph. With the fall of Cairo, the last Abbasid caliph, Al-Mutawakkil III, was brought under Ottoman protection. Although the exact nature of the transfer remains debated, later Ottoman tradition held that the caliphate, its authority and emblems, was passed to Selim. Whether formal or symbolic, this act crystallized the new political reality. The Ottoman Sultan was now the preeminent leader of the Muslim world, uniting temporal power with spiritual legitimacy. The empire had become a caliphate not by declaration, but by conquest and consensus. Salim's incorporation of Egypt and the Levant was accompanied by a sophisticated administrative restructuring. Recognizing the complexity of these territories, he preserved many elements of Mamluk governance while placing them under Ottoman supervision. The eyalet system was expanded to include the new provinces of Damascus, Aleppo, and Egypt, each governed by a beylerbey reporting directly to Istanbul. Local notables were co-opted into the new order, ensuring continuity and minimizing resistance. The Ottoman legal and fiscal systems were gradually introduced, blending with established traditions to create a hybrid administration suited to local conditions. Economically, the conquest opened vast new resources. The Nile's grain fed the growing population of Istanbul, while customs revenues from the Red Sea trade enriched the treasury. The pilgrimage routes to Mecca and Medina were secured, and the Ottoman state took responsibility for the maintenance and protection of the holy sanctuaries. Salim's titles now included Hadamuel Hermine, servant of the two holy mosques, signifying both humility and authority. This dual identity, ruler and servant, became a defining feature of Ottoman imperial ideology. Salim's reign also witnessed the strengthening of the Ottoman navy as a tool of imperial projection. With access to the Red Sea, the empire extended its reach toward the Indian Ocean, seeking to counter Portuguese expansion and protect Muslim maritime interests. Though large-scale naval engagements would come later, the groundwork was laid during Salim's years. Fortifications at Suez and Jeddah, and the development of a fleet capable of navigating both the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, foreshadowed the empire's future as a global maritime power. Culturally, the integration of Egypt and Syria infused the empire with new intellectual and artistic currents. Cairo and Damascus, long centers of Arabic scholarship, now contributed directly to Ottoman intellectual life. Scholars migrated to Istanbul, enriching its medreses and libraries. The influx of Arabic manuscripts, scientific texts, and legal commentaries deepened the empire's engagement with Islamic learning. Under Salim, the Ottoman chancery began to adopt a more cosmopolitan administrative language, reflecting the diversity of its expanded domains. Despite his relatively short reign, Salim's governance reflected remarkable efficiency. His administrative decrees emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and loyalty. He delegated authority to capable viziers such as Piri Mem Pasha and maintained close oversight of provincial affairs. His correspondence reveals a ruler deeply aware of logistics, finance, and religious legitimacy. Though remembered for his severity, contemporary accounts also attest to his intellectual curiosity and command of Persian and Arabic literature. Yet Salim's rule was not without strain. The rapid pace of conquest and centralization generated tensions within the bureaucracy and the military. The Janissaries, whose support had been instrumental in his rise, demanded rewards and privileges commensurate with their service. Fiscal pressures mounted as new provinces required garrisons and administrative oversight. Nevertheless, the state's financial mechanisms, refined under Bayezid and expanded under Salim, proved capable of absorbing the shocks of empire building. The careful balance between coercion and integration remained the hallmark of Ottoman expansion. By the time of Salim's death in 1520, the empire had been transformed. In less than a decade, its territory had nearly doubled, its resources multiplied, and its prestige elevated to unparalleled heights. The Ottoman frontier now encompassed the heartlands of the Islamic world. From the Danube to the Nile, from the Taurus to the Red Sea, the Sultan's authority was acknowledged. More than territory, however, Salim had acquired legitimacy, the mantle of protector of Islam, unifier of its lands, and defender of its faith. The legacy of Salim I was both immediate and enduring. His conquests reoriented the empire from a European-centered monarchy to a global caliphate. His victories established the geopolitical and ideological foundations upon which his son, Suleiman, would build an era of imperial magnificence. Where Bayezid had consolidated and Mehmed had constructed, Salim had transformed. He forged the Ottoman Empire into a world power capable of projecting influence across continents, commanding faith as well as fear. In the years that followed, chroniclers and jurists would describe Selim's reign as one of divine favor, a time when destiny seemed to align with determination. Yet his achievement was also profoundly structural. The integration of military technology, administrative sophistication, and religious authority into a coherent vision of empire. His reign demonstrated that Ottoman power rested not merely on conquest, but on the disciplined orchestration of faith, law, and governance. When Selim died unexpectedly near Korlu in 1520, en route to Istanbul, his empire stood at the zenith of potential. He left no monumental palaces, but his conquests were monuments in themselves, geopolitical architectures of enduring consequence. His son, Suleiman, would inherit not only a throne but a world stage upon which to exercise imperial ambition. The empire that Selim shaped was now poised to enter its golden age, armed with wealth, legitimacy, and a vision that extended from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. The transformation Selim had achieved was irreversible. The Ottoman state had become an empire of faith and order, uniting the spiritual and temporal under a single sultan caliph. Its frontiers defined not only geography but identity. Its authority was recognized not only by its subjects but by the broader Islamic world. The task that remained, to govern this vast inheritance with justice and purpose, would fall to a ruler of equally remarkable ability. In the years that followed, under Suleiman the Magnificent, Selim's empire would reach the height of its classical grandeur. Yet the foundation of that greatness, the unification of lands, laws, and legitimacy, was the work of Selim I, the ruler who transformed a sultanate into a global empire. When Selim I died in 1520, the Ottoman Empire stood as the dominant power of the Islamic world, unified from the Danube to the Nile and from the Persian frontier to the Mediterranean Sea. The task that lay before his successor was to govern, consolidate, and perfect what conquest had created. The new sultan, Suleiman, inherited a realm of unprecedented magnitude and promise. Only 26 years old, he was the product of both palace education and frontier exposure, tempered by the intellectual refinement of Istanbul and the martial discipline of provincial command. History would know him by many titles: Kanuni, the lawgiver, and Al-Kanuni, the legislator, but to the world beyond his dominions, he would become the Magnificent, the embodiment of imperial authority and cultural splendor. The accession of Suleiman in September 1520 was marked by both stability and anticipation. The Janissaries, whose loyalty had been ensured through generous donatives, acclaimed him without resistance. The provinces, exhausted by Selim's campaigns, welcomed a ruler who promised justice and order. From the outset, Suleiman's approach differed from that of his father. Where Selim had ruled through fear and speed, Suleiman ruled through vision and structure. His reign would not merely expand the empire's boundaries, it would give them permanence and purpose through law, architecture, and administration. The first years of his rule were dominated by the consolidation of authority and the reassertion of imperial prestige abroad. Europe, fragmented by religious and dynastic rivalries, viewed the Ottoman succession with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Yet within months, Suleiman demonstrated that the empire's energy had not diminished. In 1521, he launched his first campaign, directed against the Kingdom of Hungary. The fortress of Belgrade, long a symbol of Christian resistance and the site of Ottoman defeats in earlier centuries, became his first target. After a meticulously organized siege, Belgrade fell to Ottoman forces, opening the gateway to Central Europe. The conquest had both strategic and symbolic resonance. It avenged past failures and demonstrated to Europe that Selim's son was no less a warrior. The following year brought a campaign of even greater ambition. The island of Rhodes, ruled by the Knights Hospitaller, had long been a thorn in Ottoman maritime interests. From its fortified harbor, the Knights disrupted Muslim shipping across the eastern Mediterranean and provided refuge to corsairs hostile to Ottoman commerce. In 1522, Suleiman assembled one of the largest amphibious operations of the 16th century. Over 400 ships carried troops, engineers, and artillery to the island, beginning a siege that would last nearly 6 months. The defense was fierce, but Ottoman perseverance and engineering superiority prevailed. When the knights finally surrendered, Suleiman granted them safe passage, an act of magnanimity that enhanced his reputation for chivalric conduct as much as his conquest affirmed his power. The twin victories of Belgrade and Rhodes established Suleiman's authority across two spheres, Europe and the Mediterranean. They also marked the beginning of a reign that would combine relentless expansion with institutional refinement. Yet the stage upon which his greatest drama would unfold lay further north, in the plains of Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary, weakened by internal factionalism, stood as the final major Christian power between the Ottomans and the heart of Central Europe. Its young king, Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia, lacked both resources and alliances sufficient to withstand Ottoman pressure. In 1526, Suleiman led an army estimated at over 100,000 men into Hungarian territory, culminating in one of the most decisive engagements of the 16th century, the Battle of Mohacs. The battle lasted less than 2 hours, but reshaped the political geography of Europe. The Hungarian forces, outnumbered and ill-coordinated, were annihilated. King Louis himself perished while fleeing the field, and with his death, Hungary's independence effectively ended. The victory at Mohacs opened the way for Ottoman suzerainty over most of the Hungarian plain, transforming it into a frontier province and buffer zone against the Habsburgs. For contemporaries, Mohacs symbolized divine favor and Ottoman invincibility. For historians, it marked the zenith of the empire's European advance. Yet conquest was only one dimension of Suleiman's ambition. From the outset, he perceived himself as the universal ruler of both justice and faith. His reign represented the full maturation of the Ottoman state, the synthesis of its military, administrative, and ideological foundations. Under his direction, the empire achieved a balance between expansion and governance unmatched in its history. Suleiman's legal reforms, known collectively as the Canon, sought to codify and harmonize the vast corpus of imperial law that had accumulated since Mehmed II. By reconciling sultanic decrees, canonym, with Islamic jurisprudence, Sharia, he created a comprehensive legal order that preserved both flexibility and orthodoxy. These reforms standardized taxation, clarified land tenure, and regulated the responsibilities of provincial administrators, ensuring consistency across a realm that now spanned 3 continents. The most influential architect of these reforms was Suleiman's chief jurist, Abu Sa'ud Effendi. Together, sultan and scholar crafted a framework that elevated the rule of law to the central pillar of Ottoman governance. Justice, adalet, became the defining ideal of the age. In imperial decrees, Suleiman described himself not merely as conqueror, but as protector of the weak and guarantor of equity. The canon endured for centuries, shaping the administrative culture of the empire and earning Suleiman the enduring epithet, Kanuni Sultan Suleiman, Suleiman the lawgiver. While the law consolidated the empire internally, diplomacy and warfare extended its prestige externally. The aftermath of Mohacs brought the Ottomans into direct confrontation with the Habsburg dynasty, whose emperor, Charles V, sought to claim the vacant Hungarian throne through his brother, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria. The result was a protracted struggle for dominance in Central Europe that would last decades. Suleiman installed his own vassal, John Zapolya, as King of Hungary, thereby ensuring Ottoman influence. The conflict with the Habsburgs drew the empire into the complex network of European politics. Ottoman diplomacy now intersected with the rivalries between Charles V and Francis I of France. In an unprecedented development, France sought Ottoman support against Habsburg encirclement, leading to one of the earliest cross-cultural alliances between a Christian kingdom and an Islamic empire. Suleiman's campaigns into Central Europe continued throughout the 1530s. In 1529, he besieged Vienna, the Habsburg capital, in what would become one of the most famous confrontations of his reign. Despite logistical difficulties and adverse weather, the attempt demonstrated the reach of Ottoman arms into the heart of Europe. Though the siege ultimately failed, it confirmed the empire's status as a superpower capable of threatening the central bastions of Christendom. The psychological impact was profound. Throughout Europe, the name of Suleiman became synonymous with both grandeur and fear. While the European front dominated much of his early reign, Suleiman also turned his attention to the east and the seas. The rivalry with the Safavid Empire, though checked since Calderon, remained unresolved. In 1534, Suleiman launched a campaign into Mesopotamia, capturing Baghdad and bringing the region under Ottoman control. This conquest not only secured the frontier but also carried immense symbolic weight. Baghdad, once the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, now became an Ottoman province, reinforcing the empire's claim to the caliphal legacy. Control of Mesopotamia also provided strategic depth against Persia and ensured dominion over the vital trade routes between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. At sea, the empire achieved comparable success. Under the command of Hayreddin Barbarossa, a former corsair elevated to admiral of the fleet, the Ottoman navy became the most formidable maritime force of its age. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, Barbarossa defeated a combined Christian fleet under Andrea Doria, securing Ottoman supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean for decades. The naval expansion extended beyond the Mediterranean. Ottoman ships appeared in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, challenging Portuguese incursions and asserting Islamic control over the pilgrimage and trade routes. The empire that Suleiman governed was no longer confined to contiguous territories. It was a global power whose influence stretched across continents and seas. The internal structure of this vast realm reflected remarkable administrative coherence. The imperial capital, Istanbul, stood as the empire's beating heart, both a political center and a symbol of universal order. Under Suleiman's patronage, the city underwent an architectural transformation that mirrored the grandeur of his reign. The chief architect, Mimar Sinan, a former Janissary engineer of extraordinary genius, oversaw the construction of bridges, aqueducts, mosques, and palaces that gave physical expression to the empire's ideals of balance and proportion. His masterpiece, the Suleymani Mosque, completed in 1557, stood atop one of Istanbul's 7 hills, dominating the skyline as both a religious sanctuary and a civic statement of imperial harmony. Suleiman's patronage extended beyond architecture to encompass literature, art, and education. He himself was a poet of refinement, writing under the pen name Mahibi. His verses reveal a contemplative mind, conscious of the burden of power and the transience of worldly glory. Court culture flourished during his reign. Scholars, poets, and artists from across the Islamic world found patronage at Istanbul. The Ottoman chancery produced calligraphic masterpieces, while miniature painting reached new heights in the workshops of the Topkapi Palace. The fusion of Persian aesthetics, Arab scholarship, and Turkish statecraft produced a civilization of synthesis, a hallmark of the Ottoman classical age. Suleiman's reign also witnessed the deep entrenchment of the imperial household as a political institution. The palace, with its hierarchy of eunuchs, concubines, and advisors, functioned as both domestic court and bureaucratic nerve center. Among its figures, none proved more influential than Hurrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana, a former concubine who became Suleiman's legal wife and political confidant. Her unprecedented rise reflected subtle transformations within the empire's dynastic culture. Through her, the palace became a locus of both familial affection and political maneuvering, laying the groundwork for what historians later termed the Sultanate of Women. Despite the grandeur and stability of his reign, Suleiman faced persistent challenges. The frontier in Hungary remained volatile, requiring constant military vigilance. The Safavid frontier periodically flared into conflict, demanding costly campaigns to reaffirm control. Rebellions occasionally broke out in distant provinces, testing the empire's administrative reach. Yet, through a combination of diplomacy, patronage, and force, Suleiman maintained equilibrium. His governance balanced expansion with consolidation, ensuring that new conquests were integrated into the administrative fabric rather than left as unstable outposts. The later years of Suleiman's reign were characterized by a gradual shift from conquest to preservation. By the 1550s, the empire had reached the natural limits of its expansion in both Europe and Asia. The focus turned inward, toward the refinement of law, the maintenance of justice, and the perpetuation of order. The Sultan, now in his later decades, continued to lead campaigns personally, embodying the traditional ideal of the warrior king. His final campaign, in 1566, was directed once again toward Hungary, against the fortress of Szigetvar. It was there, during the siege, that Suleiman died, at the age of 72, after 46 years on the throne. His death marked the end of an era not only for the Ottomans, but for the early modern world. Under his rule, the empire had reached its greatest territorial extent and its highest degree of administrative sophistication. It was a state of nearly 30 million subjects, governed through a system that balanced military power, bureaucratic efficiency, and religious legitimacy. The Sultan's image, preserved in European portraits and Ottoman chronicles alike, became emblematic of sovereign majesty, a ruler at once temporal and transcendent. Suleiman's legacy extended far beyond the boundaries of his own time. The laws he codified endured for centuries. The buildings he commissioned defined the skyline of Istanbul. The institutions he perfected sustained an empire long after his death. More than a conqueror or a legislator, he was the architect of an enduring order, a political, legal, and cultural synthesis that would influence the Islamic world and Europe alike. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire reached the zenith of its classical age. Its armies commanded fear, its bureaucracy commanded respect, its culture commanded admiration. Yet perhaps the truest measure of his greatness lies not in the territories he conquered, but in the civilization he consolidated. In his reign, the Ottoman ideal of universal justice, Adaleti Cihensumal, became a lived reality. The empire he left behind was not merely vast but coherent, not merely powerful but purposeful. Suleiman's death at Szigetvar closed the chapter of Ottoman ascendance, yet his spirit continued to animate the empire for generations. His successors would inherit both his achievements and his burdens, the responsibility of preserving a world order built on law, faith, and authority. To later generations, he became the exemplar of the just ruler, the measure by which all subsequent sultans were judged. In the chronicles of both East and West, his name endures as the symbol of the empire at its zenith, majestic, disciplined, and profoundly human in its pursuit of order amidst the vastness of history. When Suleiman the Magnificent died in 1566, the Ottoman Empire stood as one of the greatest powers in recorded history. Its borders reached from the gates of Vienna to the Persian frontier, from the steppes of Crimea to the deserts of Arabia. Its administrative system, military organization, and legal framework had achieved a rare equilibrium between conquest and governance. Yet within that equilibrium lay the seeds of tension. The empire's structure had been built for expansion, but its future now required management. The challenge confronting Suleiman's successors was not to conquer new worlds, but to sustain and stabilize the one already built. The succession of Selim II, known to later chroniclers as Selim the Sot, marked the first major turning point in the post-Suleimanic order. Selim, the son of Hurrem Sultan, inherited a functioning state, but not his father's energy or ambition. His accession revealed a new dynamic within the Ottoman court, the growing power of the palace and bureaucracy relative to the Sultan himself. While Suleiman had personally led 16 campaigns, Selim preferred to delegate command, relying heavily on his grand viziers, particularly the capable Sokollu Mehmed Pasha. This shift in the locus of authority did not immediately weaken the empire. Indeed, under Sokollu's statesmanship, it remained remarkably stable. But it subtly altered the balance between personal and institutional leadership that had defined the empire's classical age. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha embodied the mature Ottoman administrative ideal. A product of the Devshirme system, he rose through the ranks of the imperial household to become Grand Vizier, serving 3 sultans. His tenure, 1565 to 1579, symbolized continuity amid transition. Under his guidance, the empire maintained its military edge and its diplomatic sophistication. He oversaw a series of ambitious projects, including plans to link the Red Sea and the Mediterranean by canal, an early vision of global connectivity centuries before the Suez Canal's realization. Sokalu's diplomacy balanced confrontation with negotiation. He secured peace with the Habsburgs while extending Ottoman influence deep into North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet Selim's reign also revealed the limits of expansion and the beginnings of strain within the empire's global structure. In 1571, the Ottoman navy suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Lepanto, where a coalition of Christian powers led by Spain and Venice inflicted one of the most decisive naval losses in Ottoman history. Although the empire quickly rebuilt its fleet and retained control over the eastern Mediterranean, Lepanto marked a psychological blow. It demonstrated that Ottoman dominance at sea was no longer unchallenged. European maritime powers, propelled by new technologies and overseas ambitions, had begun to shift the balance of global power from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Despite this setback, the empire's territorial reach continued to expand under Selim II. The conquest of Cyprus in 1570 to 1571 was a major victory, achieved through a massive amphibious campaign. The island's strategic position enhanced Ottoman control over the eastern Mediterranean and its trade routes. However, the campaign also exposed the logistical and financial burdens of imperial warfare. Maintaining distant garrisons, fortifying ports, and provisioning fleets strained the treasury. The empire's economy, while vast, was beginning to experience the pressures of a changing global order. The influx of silver from the Americas into Europe triggered inflation that disrupted Ottoman fiscal stability. Prices rose sharply, while the value of coinage declined, a phenomenon known as the Price Revolution. Selim II's death in 1574 brought his son Murad III to the throne. Murad's reign, 1574 to 1595, extended nearly a quarter century and further entrenched the internal transformations that had begun under his father. The Sultan himself was more withdrawn from active governance, relying increasingly on the palace hierarchy and his viziers. The harem, once a domestic sphere, evolved into a center of political influence. The Sultan's mother, Nurbanu Sultan, and later his consort, Safai Sultan, wielded significant authority in court affairs. This period marked the full emergence of what later historians termed the Sultanate of Women, not as a collapse of power, but as a reconfiguration of it. Through correspondence, patronage, and alliances, these women maintained the continuity of rule amid the complex intrigues of succession and governance. Under Murad III, the empire's external frontiers remained active. The most significant conflict of his reign was the Ottoman-Safavid War, 1578 to 1590, a prolonged and exhausting campaign fought across the Caucasus and northwestern Iran. Initiated under Sokalu's strategic vision, the war initially achieved impressive gains. Ottoman forces captured Tabriz, Shirvan, and large parts of Azerbaijan, extending the empire's eastern frontier to its greatest extent. Yet the campaign's cost was enormous. Maintaining armies across difficult terrain and long supply lines drained the treasury and overextended administrative capacity. When peace was finally concluded in 1590, the territorial gains proved difficult to hold. The strain of continuous warfare coincided with deepening economic challenges. The empire's traditional sources of revenue, agricultural taxes, customs duties, and timar-based obligations, proved inadequate to fund the growing expenses of a gunpowder army and an increasingly bureaucratic state. The timar system, under which land revenues supported cavalrymen in exchange for military service, began to erode. Instead, tax farming, iltism, became more widespread. Wealthy individuals, often urban financiers, purchased the right to collect provincial taxes, introducing short-term profit motives into what had once been a stable land-based system. This shift increased corruption and weakened the bond between the state and its provincial subjects. In the provinces, local notables, ayan, and military garrisons accumulated power, sometimes acting with considerable autonomy. Peasant unrest and banditry grew, particularly in Anatolia, where economic hardship and the influx of demobilized soldiers produced social turbulence. These disturbances would later culminate in the Salali rebellions of the early 17th century. The Ottoman system, designed for expansion and centralized control, was being tested by the complexities of managing a mature, multi-ethnic empire in an era of global change. Murad III's final years coincided with one of the most intriguing developments in Ottoman foreign relations, sustained diplomatic engagement with Europe on relatively equal terms. Embassies from England, France, and the Dutch Republic sought commercial and political alliances, often framed as mutual opposition to Habsburg power. English merchants, operating through the Levant Company, secured trading privileges in Ottoman ports, initiating a new phase of Anglo-Ottoman relations. The Sultan's court became an arena of global diplomacy, where letters and gifts from Elizabeth I of England stood alongside envoys from Morocco and India. These exchanges reflected both Ottoman confidence and European recognition of the empire's enduring centrality to world affairs. Murad III's death in 1595 brought his son Mehmed III to the throne, a transition marked by one of the darker aspects of Ottoman dynastic practice. To secure his succession, Mehmed ordered the execution of his 19 brothers, a tragic manifestation of the long-standing policy of fratricide intended to prevent civil war. Though brutal, the act reflected the enduring anxiety surrounding succession in a polity where legitimacy was tied to bloodline and precedent rather than codified law. The pattern of secluded princes, raised within the palace rather than on the battlefield, produced rulers often ill-prepared for the demands of governance. Mehmed III's reign was dominated by the Long Turkish War, 1593 to 1606, also known as the 15 Years' War, fought against the Habsburg monarchy along the Hungarian frontier. This conflict, stretching across the final decade of the 16th century, epitomized the new character of warfare in the early modern period: long, attritional, and resource-intensive. It drained both the treasury and the morale of the Ottoman army. Yet despite setbacks, Ottoman forces continued to display resilience. In 1596, Mehmed personally led his troops to victory at the Battle of Mesokarestes, demonstrating that even a ruler of limited experience could still embody the martial ideal when necessity demanded. The Long War, however, exposed the systemic difficulties facing the empire. The Janissaries, once an elite corps of disciplined soldiers, had grown into a powerful interest group within the capital. Their demands for pay and privilege frequently disrupted the treasury and destabilized politics. Provincial recruitment faltered as fiscal pressures mounted. Inflation, exacerbated by the influx of cheap silver into global markets, eroded salaries and provoked unrest among artisans and soldiers alike. By the turn of the century, Istanbul experienced repeated riots, reflecting the growing discontent within the imperial center itself. Amid these strains, the role of the bureaucracy and the palace continued to expand. The grand viziers of this era, men such as Koka Sinan Pasha and Damat Ibrahim Pasha, managed the empire with a mixture of pragmatic adaptation and inherited tradition. They maintained diplomatic relations, administered finances, and commanded armies, often compensating for the Sultan's limited engagement. The institutional memory of the Ottoman state proved remarkably resilient. Even under stress, its administrative machinery continued to function, collecting taxes, issuing decrees, and maintaining the outward appearance of stability. The final years of the 16th century marked both continuity and transformation. The empire remained vast and formidable, its population exceeding 30 million, its cities thriving centers of commerce and culture. Istanbul, with its population approaching 500,000, was one of the largest cities in the world. Its markets connected 3 continents, and its scholars maintained a vibrant intellectual life. Yet beneath this surface of grandeur, the balance that had characterized the classical Ottoman age was beginning to shift. The integration of palace, army, and bureaucracy, the triumvirate that had sustained the empire, was becoming more fragile. By the time Mehmed III died in 1603, the Ottoman Empire faced an uncertain horizon. His young son Ahmed I inherited not only a vast dominion, but a series of structural challenges that would define the 17th century. The exhaustion of prolonged warfare, the fiscal instability of a monetized economy, and the social unrest of a population in flux all signaled that the age of easy dominance was passing. Yet the state that Suleiman had perfected remained resilient. Its institutions were adaptive, its officials experienced, and its ideology of justice and order continued to command loyalty across a diverse population. Historians have often described the period from 1566 to 1603 as the beginning of Ottoman decline, but such a label oversimplifies a more complex reality. Rather than decline, this era represented a transition from a world of expansion to one of equilibrium, from personal monarchy to bureaucratic governance, from Mediterranean hegemony to participation in a global system increasingly centered on the Atlantic. The Ottoman Empire was adjusting, not collapsing. Its resilience lay in its capacity to absorb shocks, reform institutions, and reinterpret tradition in light of changing circumstances. The death of Mehmed III and the accession of Ahmed I symbolized both continuity and renewal. The young sultan, ascending at the age of 13, would inherit a realm at the threshold of transformation. The 17th century would challenge the Ottomans to redefine their empire in a new global context, no longer the conquerors of Europe and Asia, but custodians of a vast, intricate, and enduring civilization. The legacy of Suleiman's successors was thus not the end of greatness, but the beginning of adaptation, a recalibration of imperial order in response to the currents of a changing world. In the quiet halls of Topkapi Palace, the echoes of Suleiman's age still lingered, the law codes, the mosques, the chronicles, and the idea that justice was the essence of sovereignty. But the world beyond those halls had shifted. European powers now reached across oceans. New commodities and currencies circulated through global markets. Military technology evolved with unprecedented speed. The Ottomans, though challenged, would remain central actors in this new age. Their history from 1603 onward would not be one of collapse, but of negotiation between past and future, tradition and innovation, continuity and change. As the 17th century dawned, the empire entered a new chapter, one defined not by conquest, but by endurance. The strains of inheritance, managed through wisdom and adaptation, would shape the Ottoman destiny for generations to come.